When the chips are down, how do you respond? All of us like to think that we can rise to emergency challenges, but hope to never have a moment where the extreme end of our ability is tested. Unfortunately, during what should have been a routine flight, the crew of United Airlines Flight 232 was suddenly faced with an unimaginable disaster, a scenario considered so improbable there was no formal procedure for addressing it. This is the tragic yet miraculous tale of the crash of UA Flight 232 and how the flight crew rose to the challenge and attempted to do their very best under the circumstances. On Wednesday, July 19, 1989, UA Flight 232 took off at 2:09 p.m. Central Time from Stapleton International Airport in Denver, Colorado. The McDonnell Douglas DC-10 jet airliner was bound for O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, with continuing service to Philadelphia International Airport. The liftoff was picture perfect. The sky was bright, cloudless blue. Soon the plane was cruising at an altitude of 37,000 feet, with the autopilot engaged. In the cockpit was veteran pilot Captain Al Haynes, with two experienced co-pilots, First Officer William Records and Second Officer Dudley Dvorak. It was a full flight with 296 souls aboard. In addition to the 3 pilots, there were 8 flight attendants and 285 passengers. Due to a Children's Day promotion where children could fly for 1 cent with the purchase of a regular adult ticket, there was an unusually high number of children on the flight, 52 to be exact. 4 of these children were lap children or children under 2 years old, and per American flight regulations could be held in the parents' arms with no seats of their own for the duration of the flight. The first half of the 2-hour flight was uneventful. Then, at 3:16 p.m., while the plane was making a right turn over Iowa, there was a loud bang in the rear. An explosion jolted the plane, causing it to shudder violently. Immediately, several freaked-out passengers wondered if a bomb had gone off. On the flight deck, the pilots were bombarded with warning alarms and flashing lights. The autopilot disengaged and Officer Records took control of his steering column. The flight instruments indicated that engine number 2 on the tail had malfunctioned. So Captain Haynes and Officer Dvorak rapidly shut it down, which stopped the plane shaking. Luckily, DC-10s are equipped with 3 engines. Engine number 1 is mounted in the front of the left wing. Engine number 2 is in tail, and engine number 3 is mounted in the front of the right wing. The plane could still fly with only 2 engines working. Captain Haynes hastily made a reassuring announcement over the PA that engine number 2 had some problems and as a result, they might be a few minutes late to O'Hare. However, as this was happening, the plane suddenly swerved hard to the right, began to roll over, the nose diving. Officer Records turned his steering column trying to straighten out the plane, but it wouldn't respond to his commands. Captain Haynes also tried turning his steering column, but the plane still wouldn't respond. Officer Dvorak quickly realized that the gauges registering fluids for all 3 hydraulic systems were displaying zeros. The plane had lost all hydraulic fluid, therefore losing all conventional flight controls. The hydraulic systems on the plane control vital functions such as steering and manipulation of the flaps, ailerons, rudders, and braking systems. The DC-10's 3 hydraulic systems are fully independent of each other and are designed to be redundant in case of an emergency, meaning that the plane could fly with just one of the hydraulic systems working. For all 3 hydraulic systems to fail on a DC-10, it's a 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance. In just seconds after the explosion, the plane was more or less simply sailing through the sky on an unmanageable trajectory, much like a thrown paper airplane. A single question dominated Captain Haynes' thoughts. How do we keep this plane in the sky? Thankfully, the number 1 and number 3 engines on each wing appeared to be working properly. To level out the tilted plane, Captain Haynes decided to use the throttles to manipulate the remaining engines. He throttled back the power of the left engine to idle and increases the power to the maximum on the right engine. This caused the plane to yaw left and the air to flow slightly faster over the right wing, generating more lift and forcing the wing down, which leveled out the plane. In the cabin, passengers were panicking. Chief Flight Attendant Jan Brown and the rest of the flight staff have been attempting to keep things as calm as possible. Captain Haynes calls Brown to the deck and informed her of the situation. Back in the cabin, she thought calling a meeting with the flight attendants would scare passengers, so she surreptitiously alerted them one by one as she passed them in the aisle. As it just so happened, seated in first class was Denny Fitch, a United Airlines pilot instructor. Despite crew reassurances, he knew there was something very wrong. He let the flight attendants know his job and stated that he'd be happy to help the flight crew. At 3:29 p.m., about 15 minutes after the explosion and the loss of controls, Captain Fitch joined the flight crew in the cockpit. They explained the issue and have him go look out a cabin window to check if the ailerons are moving when they attempt to steer them. They're not. Captain Haynes has Captain Fitch take over control of the throttle for the 2 working engines. He maintains a white-knuckled grip on the throttle for the rest of the flight, while Captain Haynes and Officer Records continue to manipulate the steering columns in the hopes that they can control the plane. Meanwhile, Officer Dvorak has been communicating with air traffic control, the UA maintenance base in San Francisco, McDonnell Douglas, the maker of the plane, basically anyone they could get a hold of. It's considered virtually impossible that all 3 hydraulic systems would fail on a DC-10, and there's no emergency procedure to deal with the crisis. Furthermore, no one has any real suggestions on what to do. The pilots of UA Flight 232 are on their own. Captain Haynes realizes the best course of action is to make an emergency landing as soon as possible. They decide on the small regional airport of Sioux City, some 65 miles away. Captain Haynes informs Senior Flight Attendant Brown and makes an announcement over the PA, telling passengers to prepare for a crash landing. In addition to the plane constantly skewing right and trying to roll over, the plane's doing what's called in aviation a phugoid cycle. Basically, it's acting like a ship going over heavy waves. It pitches and climbs, then pitches down and descends, while speeding up and slowing down as it goes downhill and uphill. With each iteration of the cycle, the aircraft loses approximately 1,500 feet of altitude. In the cabin, Brown and the other flight attendants go row by row checking seatbelts, making sure that all passengers know what to do. Per United Airlines rules, the parents of lap children are told to place the babies on the floor and, when bending in the brace for impact position, hold them in place. In the cockpit, the 4 pilots worriedly discuss whether to try to use the landing gear or land the plane on its belly. Landing gear is controlled by hydraulics. However, on a DC-10, when the landing gear doors are open, gravity will make the landing gear fall out and lock into place. Also, there's a lever for activating the landing gear, which also unlocks the outboard ailerons. They hope that when the landing gear is in place, some residual hydraulic fluid will flow back into the proper system and they'll be able to steer the plane. On the other hand, the pilots have been managing to keep the plane in the air through throttle usage. Trying to utilize the landing gear could cause a whole new set of problems. At around 3:49, some 30 minutes after the initial explosion, the pilots use the lever to open the landing gear doors. Luckily, the landing gear drops, locks into place, and doesn't cause other issues. The landing gear actually somewhat increases the stability of the flight, although it doesn't push any trapped hydraulic fluid to the controls. Meanwhile, in Sioux City, the airport's been preparing for a crash landing with ambulances, fire trucks, and volunteers. Fortuitously, 2 Sioux City hospitals, one of them a regional burn center, are in the midst of a shift change. This means more people are available to treat survivors. For the last 20 minutes or so, Flight 232 has been flying towards Sioux City Airport in wide, awkward loops, trying to dump as much fuel as they can to make the plane, which weighed some 3,600,000 pounds, including passengers and luggage, lighter before attempting to land. The plan is to land on runway number 31, which at 9,000 feet long is the longest runway at the airport. But Flight 232 comes out of a turn lined up with closed runway number 22, which unfortunately is where all the emergency services vehicles have been parked. Worried about keeping the plane in the air, they decide not to make another approach and warn air traffic control that they'd land on the shorter 6,600-foot runway number 22. Just minutes before the plane touches down, emergency services scramble to move their vehicles. Flight 232 would be landing at a high rate of speed. With the loss of hydraulics, the flaps couldn't be extended, which meant flight crew would be unable to control both the airspeed and sink rate. Another huge problem is that hydraulics also control the braking system for the plane. At the edge of runway 22 was a cornfield. They hoped that as the plane touched down, it could roll into the cornfield and that would help slow it. On the final descent, Flight 232 is going 220 knots and falling out of the sky at 1,850 feet per minute, approximately 400 kilometers an hour forward and 34 kilometers an hour downward speed. This is over twice the speed of a normal safe landing. In the cockpit, alarms sound for the ground proximity warning. The cabin is utterly silent as the flight attendants shout for passengers to brace for landing. At 4 p.m., the right wing of the wobbling plane struck the ground, spilling 10,000 pounds of kerosene and bursting into flame on impact. The clang of steel hitting the runway reverberated through the cabin as the plane bounced and skidded forward. The plane broke into 3 main pieces as it careened down the runway and skidded into the cornfield. The cockpit went one way, the tail another, and the main center of the aircraft slid sideways, rolled over onto its back, and came to a stop upside down in the cornfield. Passengers are tossed about, some still strapped in their seats. Due to a ruptured fuel tank, a huge orange fireball rolls through the cabin. Survivors help each other out of the burning plane as first responders rush to the chaotic scene. It took rescuers almost 30 minutes to identify the debris that was the remains of the cockpit. It had burrowed into the ground due to force. It took a forklift and cutting equipment to free the 4 alive but injured pilots. Captain Haynes was knocked out upon impact. He had a severe concussion and received 90 stitches. The wreck of Flight 232 burned for 2 hours. 34 ambulances and 9 helicopters transported the injured. Of the 296 people on board, 111 died, while 185 or 62.5% of the passengers survived. 125 passengers suffered only minor injuries, and 13 actually walked away unharmed. 11 children, including 1 lap child, died. 35 passengers survived the crash, only to pass away of smoke inhalation while trying to escape from the wreckage. Only a single crew member died, flight attendant Renee LeBeau. The tragedy was the 5th deadliest crash involving the DC-10. A long and complex investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, eventually revealed the cause of the tragedy. An infinitesimal flaw was created when the titanium fan disc for the plane tail engine was manufactured due to impurities in the metal melting process. Over 18 years of plane usage, stress on the flaw in the fan disc caused it to form a crack. Slowly, the crack grew larger and larger, and on Flight 232, at 3:16 p.m., the fan disc fractured, causing engine number 2 to explosively disintegrate. In a stroke of pure bad luck, shrapnel perforated the lines to all 3 hydraulic systems, which ran through the horizontal stabilizer in the tail, causing them to leak all the hydraulic fluid. Though the plane had undergone regular maintenance, the crack in the fan disc wasn't noted, although it had eventually grown big enough to be seen with the naked eye. Despite the loss of life, Flight 232 is held up as a model of CRM, or crew resource management, and studied in flight school. The number of deaths could have been far greater. Both the cockpit and flight attendant crews communicated well with one another and tried to keep cool under pressure. Though Captain Haynes was in charge, he actively listened to his co-pilots. In addition to expertise, cooperation and teamwork played a vital role in troubleshooting the unfolding problem and landing the plane. Once recuperated and cleared of any blame, the 4 pilots returned to work for United Airlines. In May of 2012, Captain Denny Fitch lost his battle with brain cancer. Captain Haynes flew for United Airlines for 35 years until his retirement in 1991. He also became a public speaker on aviation safety. Captain Al Haynes passed away in August of 2019 at the age of 87. Haunted by guilt over the death of Evan Tsao, the lap child killed during the crash, Senior Flight Attendant Jan Brown began lobbying Congress and the FAA to introduce child safety seats on board planes across the USA. Even after retiring in 1998, Jan Brown has continued her campaign. Unfortunately, despite some industry support, to this day airlines in the United States are still not required to provide infants under the age of 2 traveling as lap children with any forms of restraint. As a result of the crash, the manufacturing process for making titanium fan discs for planes was improved. Also, new aircraft designs have incorporated hydraulic fuses to insulate a punctured section to prevent total loss of hydraulic fluid. Though many people called Captain Haynes a hero, he didn't consider himself to be one. He praised his co-workers, saying he felt that they all simply just tried to do the best they could. The date is June 27, 1976, and an Air France Airbus is taking off from Athens, Greece, en route to Paris. Aboard the flight are 248 passengers, most of them are Israelis, along with 12 aircrew. Amongst the passengers, however, are 2 Palestinian and 2 German terrorists. And shortly after takeoff, the 3 men and 1 woman reveal concealed weapons and threaten to murder passengers if the flight is not immediately diverted. The aircrew radios their situation to the ground authorities and changes heading for Benghazi, Libya, where the plane lands and is refueled. 7 hours later, the plane departs and finally lands in Entebbe Airport in Uganda. Outside the plane's windows, the hostages see scores of Ugandan troops and are briefly relieved, believing themselves about to be rescued. Yet, as the plane's doors open up, an Ugandan army colonel strides up the emergency stairs and shakes hands with one of the terrorists. The Ugandans are not here to liberate the hostages. They're here to protect the terrorists. Soon after, one of the hijackers contacts international media with their demands. They want a ransom of $5 million for the release of the airplane, along with the release of 53 Palestinian and pro-Palestinian militants from prisons around the world. If their demands are not met, they will begin executing hostages on July 1st. Back in Israel, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin phoned U.S. President Gerald Ford, asking him to contact the Egyptian government and request their aid in negotiating with Ugandan President Idi Amin. Egypt, not particularly friendly to the Israeli situation, promises to do what it can. Meanwhile, the Israeli cabinet furiously argues back and forth on whether they should give in to terrorist demands or not, and prepares to release the 40 Palestinian prisoners that they're holding. The US and Britain, however, are adamant that they will not negotiate with terrorists and inform Israel that they will under no circumstances release any of their prisoners. The American and British stance is a harsh one, but a logical one. If these terrorists and their demands are surrendered to, then it will only encourage further terrorism. Meanwhile, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat attempts to negotiate with Amim, but makes no headway. He then turns to the Palestinian Liberation Organization and surprisingly gets Yasser Arafat to send his political aide to Uganda to negotiate with the hostage takers, though the hijackers refuse to see him. A political situation is quickly becoming untenable, but the Israeli government asks the hijackers for another week in order to buy themselves more time. President Amim, who has been in contact with an Israeli Defense Force officer whom he had a long personal history with, agrees to negotiate with the terrorists after he is told that Israel is preparing to release their prisoners. The hijackers release 48 non-Israeli hostages on the 30th of June, and after agreeing to a deadline extension, release another 100 non-Israelis, all of which are flown to Paris. This leaves 84 Israeli hostages, 10 French hostages, and the aircrew of 12 who had refused to leave with the earlier released hostages. With their extra time, the Israeli government breaks into furious discussions on how to proceed, with many wanting to agree with the hijackers' demands in order to gain a release of the rest of the hostages. Yet others, mostly those from the intelligence and military community, refute the idea, warning that this will only encourage further terrorism. With the pressure mounting and the US, Britain, and now France adamant that they will not negotiate with terrorists, a final decision is made. There will be no negotiation. Instead, the Israeli Defense Forces will mount a rescue, leading to one of the most incredible military operations in history. With only a week left before the noon deadline of July 4th set by the hijackers, IDF commanders convene an emergency meeting to determine a strategy for the rescue. One idea is to have naval commandos airdropped into Lake Victoria, which borders the Entebbe International Airport where the hostages are kept. Dropped into the lake, the commandos would inflate rubber boats and ride them to the airport, where they would engage and kill the hijackers, and then hold their position and ask President Amim for safe passage home. The plan is almost immediately shot down. For one, the Israelis are told that the lake is infested with Nile crocodiles, and there are serious concerns about Ugandan President Amim's support for any rescue operation. Rather than allow the rescuers to fly home, he might order an attack on the Israeli forces instead, which would lead to a slaughter. The Israelis have two major problems to overcome in devising a realistic rescue attempt. First, they need more solid intelligence on the airport and its layout. And secondly, they must get the assistance of an East African nation for the raid, as the Israeli military lacks the capability to refuel 4 to 6 military aircraft so far away from Israeli airspace. The Americans have a huge airborne refueling fleet, but in order to get their tankers on station to support the Israelis, they too would need the permission of several African nations to fly through their airspace, and such a plan risks tipping off Amim to a pending rescue attempt. Instead, the Jewish owner of a hotel chain in Kenya, along with other prominent members of the Jewish and Israeli community in that nation, all pressure Kenyan President Jomo Kenyatta to support the IDF raid, thus securing Kenyan permission for the IDF task force to cross into their airspace and refuel at what is today Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. Further, Kenyan Minister of Agriculture Bruce McKenzie persuades President Kenyatta to allow Mossad agents into the nation so they can collect information across the border in Uganda on the Entebbe airport. Within 24 hours, Israeli Mossad agents have crossed the border into Uganda en route to scout out the airport and its defenses. Other Mossad agents, meanwhile, have flown to Paris, where they're conducting interviews with the released hostages. One of them, a French-Jewish passenger with a military background, has an extraordinary memory and is able to provide information not just on the airport, but on the hijackers and the number and types of weapons they carry. All this information is relayed back to the IDF, who have also contacted the Israeli construction company, which had actually built the exact terminal where the hostages are being kept years ago. Building a miniature replica of the terminal, the Israelis begin to piece together where the hostages may be being kept and prepare their strike force. The plan is risky, but simple. 4 C-130s would take off from Israel and head to Uganda with a strike force of 100 commandos who would assault the airport terminal, secure the airport against any Ugandan military forces responding to the attack while the planes refueled, and then fly everyone home. The men are split into 3 elements. Ground command and control consists of a small group, including the ground commander, Brigadier General Dan Shamron, and support and communications personnel. The assault element consists of a 29-man assault force, led by Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, and made up entirely of commandos from the elite Sayeret Matkal unit. They will be the spearhead of the assault and are tasked with breaching the terminal and rescuing the hostages. The security element is the largest element and is made up of 3 parts. A force of paratroopers will secure the airport field, clear and secure the runways, and protect the aircraft while they're fueling. The Golani force will secure the C-130 tasked with rescuing the hostages and board them, while also acting as general reserves and reinforcing where needed. The Sayeret Matkal force will clear the military airstrip nearby and destroy a squadron of MiG fighter jets on the ground to prevent any possible interceptions by the Ugandan Air Force. They will also repel any attack by Ugandan military forces responding from the nearby city of Entebbe. The plan is set, and with time nearly running out late in the evening of July 3rd, just hours before the July 4th deadline, the strike force loads into their waiting C-130s. The 4-plane flight takes off and flies over the Red Sea at a height of no more than 100 feet. From their windows, the soldiers could see waves breaking below them as the airplanes roar along at almost 400 miles an hour. The strike force is flying low and fast to avoid radar detection by the Egyptians, Sudanese, and the Saudi Arabians, fearing that if they are detected, the mission may be given away. Plus, there is the added concern that any one of these nations, not currently on friendly terms with Israel, may decide to intercept the flight. The Israelis, after all, did not gain permission to penetrate or approach their airspace. While flying at 30 meters lets the Israelis avoid ground-based radar, if any military aircraft happen to be in the sky, they would be very quickly detected by airborne radar. And so far out of range of Israeli jets, there would be no hope of protecting the strike force from hostile attack. Nervously, the pilots keep an iron grip on their control sticks. At such low altitudes, the smallest mistake will send them plummeting into the ocean, just 100 feet below them, disintegrating the massive planes on impact. Trailing behind the strike force's C-130s are a flight of 2 Boeing 707s, civilian transports that have been retrofitted with medical facilities, and a command post for the commander of the operation, General Yekutiel Adam. Hours later, the planes have landed at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi, Kenya. One of the 707s, the medical support plane, is left behind, while the other 5 planes are refueled and take off for the assault on Entebbe International Airport. On approach to the airport, the remaining 707 circles overhead, allowing General Adam to remain in contact with his forces on the ground. At 2300 hours, the 4 C-130s all make a combat landing on the airport's runway, their cargo bay doors already open and ready to discharge the men inside. In the darkness, though, the first plane almost taxis straight into a ditch, but the other 3 land without incident. From one of the C-130s, a black Mercedes made to look like President Amin's personal vehicle rolls out, followed by 2 Land Rovers, all bearing the insignia of the Ugandan president. Inside each vehicle are Israeli commandos, hoping to be able to roll past 2 known security checkpoints. However, as the vehicles approach, one of the sentries orders the cars to stop. He knows that Amin has recently purchased a white Mercedes and is suspicious. As the vehicle rolls to a stop, Lieutenant Colonel Netanyahu orders the commandos inside to shoot the sentries. The commandos fire 2 shots at the sentries using their silenced pistols and roll away. Yet, as one of the Land Rovers approaches, they realize the sentries are still alive. Orders are clear. There can be no sentries left alive who may raise the alarm. The last Land Rover pulls to a halt, and an Israeli commando hops out, killing the 2 sentries. Upon hearing the gunshot from the commando's unsilenced rifle, the assault force fears that they've been given away, and the vehicles roar to the airport terminal at high speed. Meanwhile, armored personnel carriers are being hurriedly unloaded from the other C-130 planes. One force of armored vehicles hurries to the main entrance of the airport to set up a defensive position should Ugandan military forces respond from the city. The other immediately roars to the adjacent military airfield and begins to rake the 11 Ugandan MiGs with cannon fire. Ugandan pilots rush out from their barracks in a panic, but upon seeing their planes being destroyed by heavy cannon fire, flee from the airfield. In moments, all that remains of the MiGs are smoking wrecks riddled with heavy caliber machine gun fire. On the flight line, the security element has fanned out around the C-130s as the planes begin to refuel from onboard fuel tanks. The mood is tense and suddenly gunfire is heard from the direction of the airport control tower as the Golani force comes under fire from Ugandan army forces. Back inside the terminal, the commandos burst into the building. One of the soldiers uses a bullhorn and screams in both English and Hebrew, stay down, we are Israeli soldiers." Unfortunately, a 19-year-old boy stands up in the confusion and is immediately cut down by the commandos, who believes that he is one of the hijackers. Another hostage is also fatally wounded by the commandos in the confusion, but the rest dive to the floor and keep their heads down. One of the hijackers, the German Wilfried Bose, rushes into the hall holding the hostages and brandishes his AK at them, but a moment later seems to have a change of heart. Instead of firing at them, he orders the hostages to seek shelter in the bathroom, then turns and starts firing at the commandos. In moments, he is cut down by Israeli gunfire. One of the commandos asks the hostages where the rest of the hijackers are, and the hostages all point at a door inside the terminal's main hall. The commandos quickly form an assault team, lining up on either side of the door and toss in 3 hand grenades. As soon as the grenades explode, the commandos burst through the doors to discover the wounded and stunned hijackers, who are immediately shot dead. With the building secure, the commandos rush the hostages to the exit and hurry them along to a waiting C-130. Outside though, the Golani force is under assault by a platoon of Ugandan soldiers, most of which have holed themselves up in the airport control tower. From their vantage point, the Ugandan soldiers begin to fire down at the hostages as they're being loaded into their C-130, but the Israeli armored vehicles respond with their automatic cannons. Cannon fire blasts the concrete structure, eliminating many of the Ugandans hiding within, but return fire wounds 5 of the commandos and kills the assault element's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu. In response, the Israelis fire a rocket-propelled grenade into the tower and strafe it with machine gun fire, effectively silencing any opposition within. Loading the rest of the hostages and Netanyahu's body onto the plane, the assault force is quickly in the air. The entire operation has lasted only 53 minutes, with the assault itself only lasting 30 minutes. 7 hijackers, 33 to 45 Ugandan soldiers, and 11 Ugandan MiGs have been lost to the Israeli commandos, and only 3 hostages have been killed, with 10 wounded. The C-130s fly to Nairobi and link up with the waiting medical plane, which immediately begins to treat the wounded as it climbs into the sky and heads for home. In the aftermath of the raid, Israel faced international condemnation from many states, with a resolution raised in the UN by Benin, Libya, and Tanzania, condemning Israel for what it called provocative actions, though it was not put to a vote. The Ugandan and Israeli representatives were summoned before the UN Security Council after a complaint was filed by the chairman of the Organization of African Unity, charging Israel with an act of aggression. The Ugandan foreign minister claimed that the hostage situation was nearing a peaceful diplomatic resolution, while the Israeli ambassador charged Uganda with being fully complicit in the hijacking. In the end, a general resolution condemning international terrorism and calling for stronger civil air security without condemning Israel's actions was raised, but failed to pass in the General Assembly. Most Western nations would go on to praise the Israeli raid, with representatives of the UK and the USA congratulating Israel on an impossible operation. Uganda's President Amin, however, was furious and threatened direct military action against Kenya for their support of the operation. In response, the US dispatched the supercarrier USS Ranger and her escorts to the Indian Ocean and based it off the Kenyan coast, ready to respond if Uganda followed through with its threats. While he did not take direct military action against Kenya, Amin did order the murder of one of the hostages who had been left behind, Dora Bloch, a 74-year-old Israeli woman who had been taken to the hospital after choking on a chicken bone. Ugandan military officers showed up at her hospital room and dragged her out of her bed before fatally shooting her, along with several Ugandan doctors and nurses who tried to intervene. Amin would also go on to order the killing of hundreds of Kenyans living in Uganda in retaliation, with as many as 245 Kenyans killed by July 11 and 3,000 fleeing the nation as refugees. This episode was brought to you by Skillshare. Get 2 months of Skillshare for free and learn new skills by using the link in the description. The person known as D.B. Cooper may have pulled off one of the greatest feats of criminality known to man, not just because of the crime, but more the subsequent literal vanishing into thin air. Some criminals go down in history as almost heroic. They become the stuff of folklore. We have noble highwaymen. We have people that robbed the rich only to share their spoils with the poor. We have bank robbers such as John Dillinger, who became a legend after stealing from the big bad banks and being very kind with the swag. Then we have outlaws such as Jesse James, whose legend appears to be somewhat overblown in both books and movies. But in today's show, we'll focus on the man whose actions were certainly not fiction. Welcome to this episode of the Infographics Show. Who was D.B. Cooper? Before we start sleuthing, we must know what it is this man did. We should also tell you that the name D.B. Cooper was a given name by the media. Who he really is still up for speculation. We'll get around to the theories later. 'Twas the night before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971, when through the doors of the busy Portland International Airport, a man went up to the check-in counter for Northwest Orient Airlines. Throughout the USA, people were traveling back home or already drinking the festive hooch. Turkeys were thawing, corn pudding had been made in the morning. The man checked in under the name Dan Cooper. He was to take a half-hour flight to Seattle, a short trip home presumably to spend time with loved ones. That was far from the case. He was about to create criminal history. He walked onto a Boeing 727-100. Some people say he sat in seat 18C, but others dispute that. Whatever the seat, it seems our Mr. Cooper was in the mood for merriment. He sat back, lit up a smoke, and imbibed in a bourbon and soda. According to witnesses who were later interviewed, he wore a dark suit and a black tie, decorated with a mother-of-pearl tie pin. From the sketches you could say he looked not unlike Don Draper from the series Mad Men. And a madman the man known as Dan Cooper certainly was. He was later described by flight attendants to be 5 foot 10 inches to 5 feet 11 inches tall, 170 to 180 pounds. It's said that he has tanned skin and was likely in his 40s. Not long into the flight, this smartly dressed man handed a note to a flight attendant. Her name was Florence Schaffner, and she was probably used to single guys handing her phone numbers, so she just put the note in her purse. According to New York Mag, this 23-year-old cute, perky, and sexy stewardess was not unaccustomed to guys hitting on her. This time was different. Cooper then leaned over to her and said, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She looked at him and knew he wasn't fooling around. The note read, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit beside me." She did just that, and the man showed he wasn't kidding, offering her a glimpse of some sticks of dynamite and lots of wires attached to a battery. He then apparently told her, "I want $200,000 by 5 p.m. in cash, put in a knapsack. I want 2 back parachutes and 2 front parachutes. When we land, I want a fuel truck ready to refuel. No funny stuff or I'll do the job." $200,000 in today's money is about $1.2 million. He wasn't too greedy, it seems. According to Schaffner, she was reeling with fear. Was the plane about to explode? Were a lot of people about to get grilled in midair before the turkey was even roasted? She was confused too. This smartly dressed guy had been polite. He'd even given her a $20 bill for the whiskey and told her she could keep the $18 change. He wasn't a political terrorist, one of the sky pirates she'd heard about. Another flight attendant later remarked he wasn't nervous. He seemed rather nice. He was never cruel or nasty. He was thoughtful and calm all the time. She went to the cockpit and told the news to the crew, after which the pilot informed the Seattle-Tacoma Airport Air Traffic Control, and the authorities were alerted. The plane circled in the air for around 2 hours with the passengers not knowing what was going on. They were told the plane was experiencing a minor mechanical difficulty. What was really happening is that the authorities had decided to meet the hijackers' demands, and they were putting together a list of things, including the money he had asked for. The man stayed calm and even started talking about what he could see down below, meaning he obviously knew the area well. He ordered another bourbon and again told Schaffner she could keep the change. Down below, the money was being put together in unmarked bills, although it said Cooper wasn't happy with the military-issue parachutes. He wanted civilian parachutes, and they had to be taken from a nearby skydiving school. The aircraft landed at 5:39 p.m. at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Cooper told the pilot to taxi to a brightly lit area of the airport and wait for all the window shades to be lowered, lest a sniper try and take him out. Northwest Orient Seattle operations manager Al Lee delivered the cash and the parachutes to the aircraft. Cooper then told the passengers they could go, as could 2 of the flight attendants, including Schaffner. 1 remained. He then told the cockpit crew that they would all be going on a trip to Mexico City, except he wanted them to fly at the lowest speed possible. He also told them to fly at 10,000 foot altitude. The pilots told him that they would need to refuel once more, and Nevada was chosen. Cooper told them to keep the landing gear down and for the cabin to remain unpressurized. He told authorities that no one could come on board during the refueling while they were in Seattle. And off they went into the skies, bounty in the bag, flying at a snail's pace for the plane. They weren't alone up there, with 5 military planes following them. It's said the last person to see Cooper was a 22-year-old flight attendant called Tina Mucklow. She said he told her to go back to the cockpit, and the last thing she witnessed was him tying something around his waist. It's said later she never talked much about the evening, and later in life became reclusive and partly lived in a nunnery. With the crew all in the cockpit, they heard an alarm indicating that the aft air stair apparatus had been deployed. Apparently, the pilot sent a warning that this was very dangerous. It was around 8 p.m., just over 2 hours after the aircraft landed, and the mysterious bourbon-quaffing hijacker was not one of the occupants of the plane. Here's a little song about what likely happened sometime after 8. Out on a little service doorway in the rear of the plane, Cooper jumped into the darkness into the freezing rain. They say that with the wind chill, it was 69 below. Not much chance that he'd survive, but if he did, where did he go? Indeed, where did he go? The feds looked all over for him, for the parachutes, for anything. They went through every bit of forest where he might have landed. A submarine scoured lakes, but the man had vanished. It was the largest search ever by law enforcement, and in the end, all they found were the remains of a girl that had been abducted and murdered. For years, the police searched for the money as all the bills had serial numbers, but they never showed up either, except when a couple of swindlers tried to get a $30,000 reward from Newsweek by counterfeiting the bills with the serial numbers. The press had a field day, and it was a mistake made by a reporter which gave him the name D.B. Cooper. It stuck. As for the American people, most folks loved the story of the handsome, well-spoken, James Bond-like character. People rooted for him, likely to the chagrin of law enforcement. He was like a noble highwayman of modern times, a Robin Hood of the skies. What the cops did know is that this guy knew how to parachute. He knew planes. He knew the area. How hard could it be to put the pieces together? Very hard is the answer. The FBI had lots of leads that came into nothing, changing their story a few times. For instance, the FBI later said that he was likely not someone who knew a lot about parachuting. We concluded after a few years that this was simply not true, they said. No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch-black night in the rain with a 200-mile-an-hour wind in his face, wearing loafers and a trench coat. It was simply too risky. It was concluded by some that the man had simply died, and the authorities had failed to find the body. He even had copycats, such as Richard McCoy, a former Vietnam helicopter pilot who tried to do the same. He was arrested in a matter of days, and he swore that he was not Cooper, just a guy trying his luck. But was it him? While he was serving a 45-year sentence, he had made a courageous and cunning prison escape, only later to be killed in a shootout with cops. The agent that killed him said this: "When I shot Richard McCoy, I shot D.B. Cooper at the same time." However, that doesn't quite work, as McCoy's family told police while Cooper's air heist was going on, McCoy was with them having a party for Thanksgiving Eve. Then in 1980, an 8-year-old boy on holiday made a discovery when he was on the riverbank of the Columbia River. The boy pulled $5,800 from the bank, all in $20 Federal Reserve notes. This was part of the ransom. Many theories were put forward as to how the bills ended up there. Did they float there? Were they buried there? No one really knew. Some people thought it was Ted Mayfield, a skydiving teacher with a history of criminality, including stealing a plane and armed robbery. Mayfield even called the FBI 4 hours after the heist to give them a list of skydivers who might have done it. But there's no cognate evidence to say Mayfield was D.B. Cooper. What about Kenneth Christensen? He was a spitting image for the sketch of Cooper. He was a former paratrooper, and he'd even spent time working as a flight attendant on Northwest Orient. He was usually broke, but then in 1972 suddenly had bags of cash and bought a house. It gets better. On his deathbed in 1994, he told his brother, "There's something you should know, but I cannot tell you." The brother then discovered that in his bank he had around $200,000, and he had also been left gold. Meanwhile, flight attendant Schaffner said he was a dead ringer for Cooper. The brother wrote in 2004, close to death himself, "Before I die, I would like to find out if my brother was D.B. Cooper. From what I know, I feel that he was, and without a doubt." We very much doubt it was Barbara Dayton, a trans woman who had once said she did it to get back at the airline for not being able to get a commercial pilot's license. She changed her tune anyway when she found out she might actually be charged for the hijacking. What about William Gossett, an ace parachutist who had survival training? According to an attorney called Galen Cook, Gossett had admitted he had done it. Gossett's son believes his dad did it. saying he got very rich in 1971 and then went on a gambling spree in Las Vegas. Still, the evidence is weak. Then there's Robert Richard Lepsey, whose car was found nearby the airport and who suddenly decided to take off to Mexico. When his daughter saw the sketch of Cooper, apparently she shouted, "That's Dad!" She gave the FBI a DNA sample some years later, but it seems they didn't think Lepsey was their man. Still, we might wonder if he's sipping on pina coladas right now, basking on an Acapulco beach at the expense of an American insurance company. Or could it have been Dwayne Weber, who told his wife just before he died, "I'm Dan Cooper"? He was seen near to where the kid had found the money, and he also looked like Cooper. Again, the DNA wasn't a match, but it was also inconclusive as it was with others. They got the DNA, by the way, from Cooper's tie, which he kindly left behind before he left. Jack Caulfield also claimed he was Cooper, to a cellmate no less. He apparently suffered broken legs around the same time of the hijacking and was also in the right place. Despite his cellmate swearing it was him and trying to make a few bucks from TV and movies, no one really thinks it was Caulfield. It was just as unlikely to be L.D. Cooper, a war veteran whose niece believed he had done it. Again, there's some interesting implications, but nothing solid. Former pilot and war veteran Robert Rackstraw had all the skills to pull off such a job, and his face looked the part. Rackstraw denied it. His attorney said it was ridiculous, but many believe it was him, and the FBI wouldn't release Cooper's case file under the Freedom of Information Act because they were embarrassed some amateurs had uncovered the case. War veteran Walter R. Recca also said he was D.B. Cooper. Before he died in 2014, he gave details to his friend about the crime that had not been heard before. A fraud examiner and forensic linguist examined the evidence the friend had, and it seemed it all pointed to the fact that Recca could have been D.B. Cooper. Is this the most likely candidate? The Washington Post in 2018 wrote about this, saying, when the friend may have had compelling evidence in regard to how the crime took place and the details the friend knew, the FBI would not reopen the case if the money or parachutes were not given to them. And so, D.B. Cooper could have been one of those people, or someone else. He could have died in the fall, or there could be a totally different story behind what happened after that eventful flight on Thanksgiving Eve. The date is Christmas Eve 2019, and deep in the heart of Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, technicians are working at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, otherwise known as NORAD, to track the flight of a Russian rocket launch. In accordance with international regulations, the Russian space agency Roscosmos formally announced the launch weeks before and filed a flight plan with the UN. The launch is a curious one, as the launch trajectory doesn't follow the typical equatorial or polar orbital trajectories of most spacecraft. The Russians claim that the rocket contains a probe, which will use the highly eccentric orbit to rendezvous with a medium-sized asteroid flying past the Earth a few million miles away, itself on a highly eccentric orbit. The math checks out, and thus, as NORAD tracks the launch entering space above the US, there's no reason for alarm. Nonetheless, American space and ground-based imaging assets still track the curious Russian probe. The rocket seems to be smaller than anticipated for the launching of a deep space probe, but the Russians claim that their probe is powered by an ion engine which doesn't require much fuel. Some inside of the American aerospace and defense sector are suspicious that the launch is actually a new secret Russian military satellite, and thus NORAD is ordered to track its trajectory carefully and detect if any sub-vehicles are released from the main body of the spacecraft as it reaches orbit. The Russian spacecraft reaches a point in its orbit over the middle of the United States when suddenly the numerous electronic eyes and ears following its flight go blind all at once. At first, NORAD technicians believe that there must be some computer error within NORAD's systems itself, as the command post is not receiving any data from over a dozen of the surveillance platforms it had been using. In fact, several other assets have apparently gone offline as well, including satellites and ground-based communications and tracking stations. Then an icy cold chill grips the men deep inside their bunker at NORAD. A secret global surveillance network of space-based sensors begin to phone home, and the news they're reporting is terrifying. This sensor system dates back to the 1970s and have only one job: monitor the entire surface of the Earth from very high orbits and detect all the telltale flash and heat of a nuclear explosion. Originally designed to help enforce the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, outer space, or underwater, This space surveillance network was left in operation to help prevent rogue states from testing weapons in remote areas of the world. Now the decades-old system is calling home, and the news is troubling. A major nuclear detonation has been detected directly over the heart of the United States. Several hundred miles above the US, a nuclear flash briefly creates a second sun and lights up the sky above much of the US. Simultaneously, the titanic electromagnetic pulse sweeps over the entire nation, burning out power and communication systems across the entirety of the US and most of Mexico and Canada. Power transformers are blown, and the electricity across most of the nation is shut down permanently. Cities go dark all across the US. Radio and satellite communications equipment across the nation is destroyed by the electromagnetic pulse, and only a few pieces of military equipment specifically hardened against EMP pulses survives. In space above the US, the blast destroys dozens of satellites, knocking out communication relay networks that connect the world. The EMP blast reaches further out and manages to destroy many more satellites, though luckily more modern satellites have been hardened against the effects of the sun and are shielded from the EMP blast. In the span of a few short seconds, the United States has been sent back to the industrial age. It will take weeks to restore cross-country communications and months to begin to bring back the power to major cities. It'll be years, perhaps as much as a decade, before the American electrical grid is fully repaired. Millions will die in time, and yet this was just the opening shot of World War III. NORAD is itself shielded from the effects of an EMP pulse, and immediately it uses an old but still reliable communications network to send emergency action messages across the country. These messages reach several important American military bases, and in moments, men and women scramble to respond to the Russian attack. Everybody knows what's next, and it's vitally important that the nation restore its ability to respond to this attack as quickly as possible. Deep in the heart of Russia, giant concrete doors are already yawning open. Klaxons and warning signals sound out across a Russian plain, broken up only by the dozens of missile silos buried deep beneath its dirt. With the fiery roar, each missile lifts up into the sky one by one. At NORAD, a surviving satellite sends a missile launch warning. The president has been warned over an emergency relay system, but communications all across the US are severely hampered by the EMP attack. Nobody, not even the president, can reach the rest of the United States' nuclear alert forces to order a retaliatory attack, let alone command the US military at large. At Travis Air Force Base in California and Patuxent River in Maryland, flight and support crew rush from their alert station to huge egg-white painted aircraft. Ground crew rush to complete the few preparations needed to get this aircraft into the air, and within minutes, the big plane is already lumbering down the runway. This plane carries no bombs, no missiles, no weapons of any kind, and yet as the two aircraft on opposite sides of the country finally take to the air, they've now become the most dangerous weapons on the face of the planet. The E-6 Mercuries immediately make for a cruising altitude around 50,000 feet. Each plane is manned by 2 pilots and 3 engineers, along with a battle staff of 9. Amongst the airborne staff is a general officer, and if communications with the president or any other member of the nation's nuclear command authority can't be established, each general can assume full command of the United States' military, to include its nuclear forces. The E-6 is outfitted with a vast array of extremely powerful, jam-resistant, and EMP-hardened communications gears. Antennae ring the aircraft, and in moments, it has linked up with the nation's emergency airborne command and control aircraft, a fleet of similar planes whose job is to create an airborne communications relay system across the United States and beyond. With ground-based comms down and the US's space network severely affected, this fleet of aircraft now provide a direct link communications network, relaying signals off each other and to their final destination. Shortly after the E-6s reach cruising altitude, though, news comes in of a second nuclear detonation in Washington, D.C. This was a ground-based blast, and both crews realized that the Russians have struck at the nation's capital with a small nuclear weapon that was likely smuggled into the US. This explosion has eliminated nearly all of the upper-level command and control structure of the US government, and yet the mission of each E-6 is unaffected by the attempt to decapitate the US military and government. Assuming command, the general officer aboard the E-6, currently flying a few dozen miles off the east coast of the United States, immediately reestablishes communications with the US's ground-based missile forces. Using a system of very high-frequency and super high-frequency antennas, the E-6 is able to alert launch control officers deep in their bunkers to prepare their missiles for launch. The communication system affords so much control over the U.S.'s land-based ICBMs that the general now in command of the United States Nuclear Forces is able to reprogram the targets to several of the missiles. A second command instructs the United States Air Force to immediately begin launches of its Space Resilience program, and in minutes, converted ICBMs kept at the ready are rocketing into the sky. Shortly after, the payload fairing on each of the converted ICBMs split open, releasing a swarm of microsatellites which have been boosted into orbit around the Earth. The microsatellites immediately re-establish the U.S.'s space communications and intelligence network and starts feeding data directly into each E-6 Mercury currently in flight. Now, the general aboard the East Coast's E-6 is finally able to communicate with U.S. military forces abroad and with America's allies. Within seconds, the world at large is aware of the attack on the United States, and NATO makes preparations for war. U.S. forces abroad prepare for the war that will immediately follow the end of the world. From the rear of each E-6, an antenna is released and then dropped to trail behind the aircraft. With 5 miles of wiring, the very low-frequency antenna at the end of the wire now hangs 26,000 feet below and behind the aircraft and immediately establishes communications with the U.S.'s submarine fleet. Emergency action messages are relayed to American ballistic missile submarines, and the captains of individual boats race to make their missiles ready for launch. It's now 15 minutes after the EMP attack, and space-based sensors along with a few surviving ground tracking stations confirm dozens of Russian nuclear warheads in their mid-course trajectories. Ballistic missile interceptors based on the west coast of the United States boost into the air, launching from their silos in Alaska, California, and Washington. Thanks to data links provided by the E-6 Mercuries, the interceptors are able to close in on Russian warheads, though unfortunately they manage a measly kill ratio that knocks only a few handful of the dozens of incoming nuclear warheads out of the sky. The next line of defense is the U.S. Navy, and with targeting data relayed by the E-6's network capabilities, American destroyers on the west coast and in the Arctic fire off a salvo of SM-3 missiles, intercepting the incoming warheads in their final trajectories. The Navy fares a little better than the Air Force's ballistic missile interceptors, and another handful of warheads are knocked out of the sky by the SM-3s. Now, the crew of each E-6 aircraft braces itself. There's nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable. Luckily, they don't have to wait long. A minute after the Navy's last-ditch effort to intercept the incoming warheads, the first nuclear strike rocks the west coast of the United States. Miraculously, Los Angeles suffers only a glancing blow. Some of the warheads aimed at it intercepted in flight. San Francisco and San Diego, however, are obliterated, each taking multiple direct hits. 30 seconds later, the nuclear detonations spread east, reaching Colorado, Nevada, and Wyoming. NORAD is rocked by a near miss but survives intact. The nuclear missile fields in Montana and the Dakotas are obliterated by multiple strikes, though their own missiles have already been launched. 2 minutes after the first impact, New York, Atlanta, and Philadelphia are wiped off the map. Washington, already rocked by a small ground-based nuclear weapon, is struck again for good measure. 3 minutes after the first detonations, the U.S. is silent. Most of its major cities have been reduced to rubble. Over 100 million are already dead. America's military command structure survives, however, and the crews of the in-flight E-6 watch on monitors as the first American nuclear strikes devastate Russia. The first to strike back are America's ballistic missile submarines, and their missiles devastate Russia's seaboard cities. A few minutes later, American ICBMs rain down extinction in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Vladivostok. The first phase of World War III is over, but the war itself has only just begun. The E-6 aircraft link up with American's Airborne Emergency Communications Network and its space assets to coordinate the military response by the U.S.'s overseas forces. Many overseas American bases have been struck in the nuclear attack, but the ability to quickly restore communications afforded by the E-6s means that many other forces manage to disperse in time to avoid destruction. Now the E-6s relay orders around the globe to all surviving U.S. and NATO forces, who prepare for an assault into Russia in order to ensure that World War III does not have a follow-up nuclear exchange. On the 23rd of November 2013, China enacted an air defense identification zone over large swaths of the South China Sea, including over disputed islands that an international court at The Hague ruled China was illegally occupying. For weeks, tensions mounted across the Pacific and between China and the US, and many feared that China would escalate the situation by enacting a no-fly zone over parts or all of the South China Sea. But what exactly is a no-fly zone? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at what would happen if you entered a no-fly zone. A no-fly zone, NFZ, or air exclusion zone, is a territory over which aircraft are not permitted to fly. Typically, no-fly zones are set up in a military context and enforced by armed fighter patrols. When set up within a military context, no-fly zones are meant to keep civilian airplanes out of a war zone and can be established to warn a hostile nation not to even attempt to take the skies. Much like the US-NATO no-fly zone established against Iraq in the First Gulf War. While the terms of a no-fly zone can vary, aircraft violating it can be shot down with only a single warning, if that. In these cases, no-fly zones act like a demilitarized zone in the sky, helping keep the peace by keeping hostile aircraft out. A no-fly zone can also be set up, however, to protect sensitive locations during peacetime, such as the Olympic Games during 2012 and 2016, when Britain and China enacted no-fly zones to limit the threat of terrorism. Nations also often have established no-fly zones around important government buildings, such as the US's White House. In peacetime, no-fly zones can also be set up to limit or prevent the use of drones near sensitive installations, such as airports, observatories, or high-rise buildings, where a wandering drone could cause a serious mishap. Past no-fly zones include the one enacted by the United States, Great Britain, France, and Turkey over northern Iraq from 1991 to 2003. After atrocities committed against the Kurdish populations of northern regions of Iraq, this no-fly zone was meant to prevent any possible bombing or chemical attacks against civilians living under their protection, and was known as Operation Provide Comfort and Operation Provide Comfort 2. While not specifically authorized by the UN Security Council and called illegal by the Secretary General of the UN, few nations protested their implementation. After the start of Operation Provide Comfort in 1991, Iraq's no-fly zone was extended to the south of the country under Operation Southern Watch, in order to protect Iraq's Shia population. In 1993, during the Bosnian War, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 781, prohibiting unauthorized military flights in Bosnian airspace. This resolution led to the creation of Operation Sky Monitor, with NATO monitoring violations of the no-fly zone but not taking direct action. After 500 documented violations, including one combat violation, the UN Security Council quickly passed Resolution 816, prohibiting all unauthorized flights and allowing all UN member states to take all necessary measures to ensure compliance with the no-fly zone restrictions. This led to NATO initiating Operation Deny Flight, during which NATO engaged in its first combat engagement in history. In February 1994, two American F-16s detected a flight of 6 unidentified radar contacts inside the no-fly zone. Two other F-16s were vectored in on the unknown contacts to discover 6 Bosnian J-21s and 2 J-22s bombing a military factory at Novi Travnik, issuing 2 orders to land or exit the no-fly zone or be engaged. Per UN and NATO's rules of engagement, the F-16s orbited overhead while the orders were ignored. As the warnings were issued, the Bosnian aircraft dropped bombs over their target, immediately clearing the US planes to attack. Detecting a flight of 2 F-16s descending on them, the Bosnian jets quickly changed course, trying to retreat back to their base. Chasing the fleeing planes, one F-16 downed the first J-21 with an AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, after which the remaining jets dove for cover at low altitude, sticking close to the ground. Undeterred, the American F-16s gave chase and shot 2 more aircraft down with AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. With the first F-16 out of missiles and low on fuel, the chase was given over to his wingman, who had been flying top cover in the skies above. Dropping down and locking on, the second F-16 severely damaged the tail of another J-21. By this time, though, the American flight was running low on fuel and had to break pursuit, handing over the attack to a second flight of F-16s, which had been vectored into the firefight. The second flight managed to down 1 more Bosnian plane, and only one of the enemy planes limped home, undergoing an emergency landing. Of the 6 aircraft engaged by the US jets, 3 of the pilots were killed and 3 survived, 2 after ejecting. Operation Deny Flight would help limit the scope of the Bosnian War, denying both sides involved the use of air power, which had too often been used to target civilians. After the Bosnian Serb army threatened and then attacked UN-designated safe areas for civilians, leading to 2 massacres, Operation Deny Flight evolved to Operation Deliberate Force, a sustained and blistering air campaign conducted by NATO to help protect UN forces and undermine the capabilities of the Bosnian Serb army. In 2011, the United Nations Security Council once more approved the enforcement of a no-fly zone, this time in Libya in response to the civil war. Learning their lessons from Operation Sky Monitor in Bosnia, this time the UN resolution establishing the no-fly zone included provisions for further actions against violators, namely allowing enforcing aircraft to engage any aircraft that violated the no-fly zone without having to wait weeks for a new UN resolution. Helping protect Libya's civilian population, NATO quickly seized the opportunity to then take the offensive in Libya, bombing government positions and providing close air support for rebel forces. No-fly zones can be established in wartime to protect civilians, or in peacetime to enforce a nation's sovereignty. No matter what their nature though, it's always the best interest of a pilot to be aware of and abide by any local no-fly zones, lest it costs them their life.
On New Year's Day 1914, the world's first commercial airline called the St. Petersburg-Tampa Airboat took off to great applause and carried its passengers on a 21-mile journey from the Bay of St. Petersburg to Tampa. The journey took 23 minutes and the plane got up to speeds of 64 miles per hour. Sounds slow to you maybe, but that short trip would have normally taken a car 20 hours, a steamboat over 2 hours, and the train somewhere between 4 and 12 hours. Flying was the way to go. While in Europe, soon after, wing aircraft airlines popped up. KLM was founded in 1919 and is still running today. It wasn't until the 1930s that you saw airliners that resemble the ones you see today. And today we're going to talk about two airliner kings in this episode of the infographic show, Boeing versus Airbus. One of the first airliners that does resemble planes you see flying through the skies daily today was the Boeing Model 247. At the time, this was a highly advanced piece of machinery, replete with control surface trim tabs, something to control flaps, autopilot, and de-icing technology. This was the start of things to come, but it couldn't climb to a high altitude. So Boeing created the Model 307 Stratoliner, which had a pressurized cabin that allowed it to reach heights of 20,000 feet, way above all that bad weather. The first flew in 1938, but it was introduced as a passenger airline for Pan American Airways in 1940. But who is this company Boeing? The American Airspace Company is called the world's largest. No doubt you know that already if you fly a lot. It's not just a company helping you to get to that beach holiday in Thailand next year, but also works with developing technology for space flights, armed aircraft, and missiles. This company is diverse, so we must remember that while its main focus is commercial travel, it's also helping to launch rockets into space, missiles on people, and helping F-22 Raptors to fly at super fast speeds. The company was created in 1916 by a Mr. William E. Boeing, who was an American timber merchant. It was called the Aero Products Company for around a year, and then the name was changed to Boeing Airplane Company. It built those flying boats we discussed in the intro for the US Navy. In the 1920s, it moved into airmail services, went through several name changes and expansions, gobbling up smaller aircraft makers. In 1934, because of antitrust legislation, Boeing wasn't allowed to be both a manufacturer and a transport company. It stuck with manufacturing, as you know, and in the 30s evolved and made numerous armed aircraft as well as those airliners we mentioned earlier. In a moment we'll talk about statistics and the size of Boeing, but first let's look at the history of Airbus. As we said, while Boeing was making hay over in the USA, the Europeans were designing their own passenger aircraft. Everyone once said there's no way metal can fly. Then the German Hugo Junkers metal plane took off in 1915, although some say the first metal aircraft was Romania's A. Vlacu III. The world's first jet engines were developed in Germany and Britain, so not surprisingly, Boeing wasn't by itself in developing airliners. Actually, some people say the Russian Sikorsky Ilya Muromets was the first passenger aircraft. Europe was thriving in aircraft technology, and in the 1930s, passenger airlines sprung up, such as Imperial Airways in the UK, Lufthansa in Germany, and KLM in the Netherlands. But it was Boeing who led the way with designs of airliners, and that's pretty much how it stayed for many years. Right now, you have numerous manufacturers around the world, such as Japan's Mitsubishi Aircraft Corporation and China's Jian Aircraft Industrial Corporation, but there is one company competing with Boeing in some respects, and that's Airbus, a coalition of companies from France, Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom. It was created, in fact, to compete with the Boeing empire. The consortium started in the 1960s, but really got going in the 70s and 80s. It was still quite small during those decades, but in the 2000s, things really changed, and a number of years throughout that decade, Airbus was for the first time getting more orders than Boeing. The fierce rivalry had started. It's a close one, too. It said that from 2007 to 2016, Airbus received 9,985 orders and delivered 5,644 planes. During the same decade, Boeing had 8,978 orders and delivered 5,718 planes. Forbes wrote in 2018 that these two companies will be getting orders like never before, too, as so many more people are flying these days. The need for new planes is unprecedented, said Forbes. We are also told that Airbus plans to build 60 A320 neo jets per month around the middle of 2019. Boeing says it will build 57 737 MAXs per month during that time. Boeing currently has 4,615 outstanding orders for its 737 family, while Airbus holds a 6,126 jet backlog for its A320 series, said the article. It's close, but in 2018, CNN wrote the headline, Airbus wins sales race with Boeing for 5th straight year. The race is so close that these companies really don't like each other, with each accusing the other at times of being below standard. This is not a harmonious duopoly. But let's look at some more facts. According to Forbes' World's Biggest Companies list, while the current size of these companies is almost neck and neck in some respects, Boeing is the bigger company by far. It's 52 on the list, with $95.8 billion in sales, $9.2 billion in last year's profits, $113.5 billion in assets, and $199.5 billion in market value. Airbus was at number 101, with $74.7 billion in sales, $3 billion in last year's profits, $138.3 billion in assets, and $92.1 billion market value. We can't talk about all the planes these companies make, but let's talk about their biggest sellers and also their creme de la creme. We already know about how close orders are for the most popular aircraft of Boeing 737 and Airbus A320, but which is better? USA Today interviewed a pilot who had flown both planes, and he said that the Airbus 320 is both more comfortable, has more space, and is quieter. He also said they both fly at around the same speed. He said he preferred the Boeing when it was windy, but overall both planes were quite similar. In Salon, another pilot pitted the planes together, and he too said there wasn't much in it. The best Airbus plane, he said, was the A340, which he gave an A- to, and the best Boeing plane was a 787, which he also gave an A- to. He did give the 737 the edge over the A320 though. Another pilot said this, having piloted both the Airbus and Boeing aircraft, I am often asked which airplane is better. From a passenger's perspective, both are equally safe and comfortable, effectively getting you from point A to point B. From a pilot's perspective, however, I'm of the opinion that the Airbus A330 is a notch above the Boeing 777. What about crashes? AirSafe gives the order of safest aircraft since 2009. It goes like this, from safest to least safe. Airbus A340, Embraer 170 and 190, Boeing 747-400, Boeing 737-600, 700, 800, and 900, and Airbus A320, which includes the A318, A319, and A321. As for the best, or do we mean biggest, the Airbus 380 is the biggest passenger plane in the world and carries up to 544 passengers. It's also 40% larger than the Boeing 747-8, the next biggest plane. The problem is, these flying behemoths are not very popular with airlines, with the Telegraph saying in 2018 that if the 380 does not fly at full capacity, it's not worth flying it. They have suffered in terms of orders, but the 747-8 is also suffering. Maybe double-deckers are not the way to go. As Bloomberg writes, to most airlines, the double-decker remains an exotic addition at best, rather than the backbone of a long-distance fleet. Okay, so from all this, you know that Boeing is the company that is worth more and seems to be making more money, but that Airbus is winning in terms of orders. As for how they fly, pilots seem to see them as almost equal, with perhaps Airbus getting the upper hand. Airbus also wins for having the most luxurious and largest plane, but then Boeing's history is far more impressive. As for safety, there isn't much difference between the two companies. This episode is brought to you by Skillshare. Get 2 months of Skillshare free and learn new skills by using the link in the description. It's a well-known fact that we're safer traveling in the sky than we are traveling on land, or so they say. When disaster strikes in the sky, the results are often, as we shall see, devastating. Air disasters are headline news, and so they should be. What could be worse than a dream vacation turning into a nightmare when the controls fail in the cockpit and the cabin suddenly lunges towards terra firma? Or sometimes you're not even safe from air disaster while on the ground. A cargo plane simply drops from the sky into the crowded market where you were peacefully shopping for groceries. What happens when your passenger jet strays into military airspace and missiles start flying past the passenger windows? Here, for your viewing pleasure, is a list of some of the deadliest airline disasters ever on this episode of the Infographic Show, the top 10 worst airplane accidents. Number 1. On September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 departed Anchorage, Alaska, bound for Seoul. At some point during the flight, the plane strayed off course and veered towards the Soviet Union. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union weren't peachy at the time, and this proved to be one of the more tense points of the Cold War. As the plane steered off course towards the Soviet Union, things became critical. With Soviet missile tests scheduled for that day, the Soviets must have been feeling trigger-happy and paranoid. As the flight entered their airspace, it was shot down, killing all 269 passengers on board. The Soviets later admitted they misidentified the aircraft for a spy plane, which is understandable considering the political tensions and the weapons testing at the time. Number 2. American Airlines Flight 191 was doomed from the start. The engine broke down during takeoff at O'Hare Airport in 1979, taking a large section of the wing with it. The aircraft rolled and crashed into a field, taking out a nearby trailer park, killing 2 bystanders in the process. All 273 passengers and crew were killed in this deadly disaster. Number 3. Iran Air Flight 655 was heading from Tehran to Dubai on July 3, 1988, when disaster struck. The Airbus A300 was destroyed by an SM-2MR surface-to-air missile fired from a United States missile cruiser. All 290 passengers, including 66 children, were killed with no survivors. The flight was shot down over the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War when forces mistook it for an Iranian F-14A Tomcat flying towards them. Iran remains firm in its belief that this was no accident and was in fact an international crime. Number 4. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was involved in a similar incident over eastern Ukraine when the Boeing 777-200 flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur was targeted and shot down close to the Russian border. All 298 passengers were killed in the accident. Some airlines had already begun to avoid the Ukrainian airspace following the Crimean crisis in early 2014, but some carriers, such as Malaysia Airlines, had yet to change their routes. Number 5. The Air Africa incident at Ndolo Airport in the Democratic Republic of Congo was one of the most deadly for people on the ground. In 1996, an overloaded Air Africa cargo aircraft struggled to take off, but just kept rolling at speed, overshooting the runway. The flight, which was possibly overloaded with weapons, failed to reach the correct speed for takeoff. With increased speed, the plane crashed into a marketplace and exploded into a ball of flame, killing between 225 and 348 people and injuring some 500 others. This takes the dubious prize of being the flight to have caused the largest number of non-passenger deaths caused by the accidental crash of an aircraft. Number 6. Air India Flight 182 occurred on June 23, 1985, and was deemed the deadliest aviation terror attack at the time. The Air India Boeing 747, bound from Toronto to Sahar International Airport, crashed off the coast of Ireland following the explosion of a device placed in the cargo hold by a Mr. M. Singh, thought to be of the Sikh extremists Babar Khalsa. A second device, intended to explode simultaneously on another flight, went off early in the terminal building at Narita Airport, Japan. Number 7. Flying from Istanbul to London via Paris, Turkish Air Flight 981 had an unusually large number of passengers on board. As they flew over Meuse, France in 1974, passengers heard a muffled explosion, followed by a rush of air as the cargo door separated from the plane. Pilots fought to control the plane for just over a minute before crashing into the Ermenonville forest, killing all 346 passengers. At the time, this was the deadliest plane crash in aviation history. Number 8. In 1996, a Kazakhstan-modified military plane carrying 27 passengers and 10 crew descended to land at Delhi Airport. The crew was cleared by air traffic control to descend to 4600, but due to their limited English, they didn't realize they were to stay at that altitude. They kept descending and collided into a Saudi Arabian passenger airplane. The tail of the plane cut through the other's wing, and the Saudi Arabian passenger Boeing crashed, killing all 349 on board. All passengers and crew aboard the Kazakhstani plane were also killed either during the crash landing or later on at the hospital. Number 9. 520 passengers were killed on Japan Airlines Flight 123 in 1985. Shortly after the flight took off, the rear bulkhead failed, tearing off the rudder and destroying the hydraulic system, meaning that the pilot had zero control of the flight apart from the use of thrust. The pilot attempted to return to Tokyo, then he tried to land at an army base, but the plane would refuse to be controlled before it crashed into mountains. 4 people survived the crash and the night that followed. It is unknown how many of the 520 dead were killed on the initial impact of the crash. Search parties found the wreckage and the 4 remaining survivors the next day. Finally, number 10. The 1977 Tenerife disaster claimed 583 lives with 61 survivors. Following a terrorist bombing at Gran Canaria International Airport, Flights including KLM 4805 and Pan Am 1736 were diverted to Los Rodeos. The much smaller airport quickly became congested with parked aircraft blocking the taxiway and forced departing aircraft to use the runway. The weather conditions, which were harsh with patches of dense fog across the airfield, prevented aircraft from seeing one another clearly. The KLM flight accelerated to initiate takeoff, while Pan Am Flight 1736 was still on the runway. The impact of the two planes colliding and the ensuing explosion and fireball killed everyone on board the KLM flight and the majority of those on board the Pan Am flight, except for the 61 who survived. With 583 lives lost, this accident is the deadliest to date. As terrible as these accidents are, just remember that, statistically speaking, you're still more likely to get yourself killed in the cab on the way to the airport rather than on the airplane itself.
Flying is a great way to travel, but it's definitely got some downsides. Between the crowded seating, annoying seatmates, and terrible food, it's enough to make anyone lust after those cushy and pricey first-class seats. You probably walked enviously through at least one first-class cabin on the way to your seat. But have you ever wondered what the most expensive first-class seats are like? Well, today is your lucky day. We're giving you a sneak peek into the world's most expensive first-class cabin, so that you can imagine what it's really like to fly like the ultimate VIP. You're awoken on the day of your trip by your hotel phone ringing. Good morning, sir. I trust that you slept well. This is Amanda, your personal concierge from Etihad Airlines. You know Amanda. She's the one that booked you this room. In fact, she's been handling all of your travel arrangements since the moment you first booked your flight with her airline. You assure her that you had an excellent night and ask her to confirm your itinerary for the day. Of course, sir. Your flight to Abu Dhabi leaves at 10 this evening, so your private chauffeur will pick you up at 6 sharp to whisk you smoothly to the airport with plenty of time to check in and enjoy the private lounge. You'll be greeted at the airport by your on-the-ground attaché, who will take care of everything for you from there. Your entire experience has been curated to your exact specifications, as we've discussed. I'll let the in-flight chef know about your meal preferences, and the cabin staff has been directed to provide extra pillows as requested. When you land in Abu Dhabi, another attaché will be there to assist you from the moment you arrive, including helping you through customs, and a chauffeur will be waiting to take you to the hotel I've arranged for you there. I hope you have a pleasant day, sir, and don't hesitate to call on me if there's anything else that you need during your trip. Your chauffeur is waiting to pick you up in front of the hotel, and your concierge has already arranged for your baggage to be loaded. The car is stunning. A luxury sedan fitted out with leather seating, privacy screen, fully stocked bar, and an entertainment system. Needless to say, the ride to the airport flies by. As your car pulls to the curb at the private VIP entrance, a sharply dressed man appears at the car's door, as if by magic. Good day, sir. Etihad Airlines welcomes you. I'm James, your personal attaché. I trust you're having a pleasant day so far. That's wonderful. It's my job to keep it that way. I don't want you to worry about a thing. I'll take care of everything for you from this point on. A porter has already unloaded your bags and whisked them away to be checked in. Your bags will be placed directly on the plane for you, sir. Now, if you'll follow me to the first-class check-in lounge, it's just a short walk away, unless you'd like me to arrange a ride. You tell them that you'd welcome a last chance to stretch your legs, and you set off through a series of well-appointed back hallways. You make it through the airport in record time, in almost complete privacy, and you're even fast-tracked through security. With your attaché at your side this whole way, it is by far the smoothest airport experience you've ever had. Along the way, your attaché tells you a bit more about Etihad Airlines and their luxury first-class cabins. The Residence luxury first-class cabins are the world's only 3-room private cabins on a commercial airliner. Our first Residence cabin launched in 2014 and was so successful that we now have a total of 10 Residence cabins on the upper level of each of our Airbus A380 airliners, the largest passenger planes in the world. The A380s and the Residence cabins and lounges are exclusively available on flights to and from the cities of New York, London, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Sydney, Seoul, and Mumbai. Here we are at the first-class check-in lounge. Now, if you'd just like to make yourself comfortable here, I'll take your carry-on and your travel documents and check you in. And of course, I'll need your credit card to confirm the payment. And as you know, the cost of your fare is $38,000 US. This is our newest and most luxurious version of the Residence cabin. The next newest Residence fare is $32,000. As soon as you step foot in that cabin, I'm sure you'll agree this money is very well spent, especially compared to our other first-class seats, like the compact apartment series, with less than half the space at $20,000 for a one-way ticket. You hand over your luggage and documents and settle into one of the designer Italian leather chairs to take in the details of the first-class lounge. It includes more than just the classy lounge area you're sitting in. You also see a large bar, and a dining area, and a peek at the menu gives you a look at some of the complimentary gourmet tapas and appetizers on offer. There's also 2 luxury washrooms, including full-size showers. You're admiring the original artwork as James returns with your boarding pass and receipt. Yes, our first-class lounges are quite spectacular. This area is reserved for our first-class guests, but of course, even the economy travelers can pay to enter this part of the lounge. You can understand why they'd want to, but rest assured they will not be allowed access to your private lounge. If you'll follow me, I'll take you there now. James escorts you to your personal lounge, where you'll wait to board your flight in total privacy and comfort. Your lounge includes custom leather furniture, a huge TV, and entertainment system, and a fully stocked snack bar. I'll leave you here to relax. Our lounge attendants would be more than happy to bring you any food or drinks that you might want from the restaurant. Please let me know if there's anything else that you need. Otherwise, I'll come and fetch you when it's time to board. After a very pleasant wait that almost had you forgetting you were in an airport, your attaché returns with your carry-on luggage to let you know that it is time to board. He assures you that you are the first to board, to give you privacy and plenty of time to settle into your cabin before you take off. He leads you through the beautiful first-class gangway and onto the plane, where he hands off your boarding pass and carry-on to a gentleman wearing a crisp, perfectly tailored suit, completed with coattails and white gloves. Good evening, sir. I am Robert, your personal butler, at your service. Etihad Airlines welcomes you to the residence. Let me just stow your carry-on in your secure personal closet, and then I'll show you around the cabin. Well, as you probably know, the residence is the world's only 3-room private cabin on a commercial airliner. Your cabin features a full 125 square feet of private space. There's a spacious lounge with a state-of-the-art entertainment system, which also doubles as a dining room. You also have a separate bedroom with a double bed and a private full-sized bathroom. And now that we've had the grand tour, let's get you settled into the lounge and get you comfortable before takeoff. He settles you into the gorgeous leather reclining seat and gives you the obligatory but blessedly brief overview of the seatbelts and takeoff and landing procedures. He assures you that you will be free to roam around in your suite throughout the flight. Once settled, he asks if you'd like anything before takeoff. You'll find the chilled refreshment drawer beside you is fully stocked with the drinks you requested, and your specific snacks are in the next drawer. You have plenty of time for refreshments before takeoff, sir. Can I have the in-flight chef prepare a snack for you? You assure him you'll be fine with the snack drawer for now, but that you'd like to have dinner as soon as possible once in the air. Oh, certainly, sir. The in-flight chef has received your dining preferences, including your extensive dietary restrictions, and is ready to prepare a truly one-of-a-kind meal for you whenever you would like to eat. I've taken the liberty of pouring you a celebratory glass of our finest champagne to toast you for choosing to fly with us today. I'll leave you to settle in, but please let me know if there's anything at all that you need. As you sip your champagne, it doesn't take you long to get comfortable in the lounge. You connect up to the free in-flight Wi-Fi and are pleasantly surprised at how fast it is, and you set your devices up in the convenient charging station. You turn on the 32-inch LCD TV and look for a movie to watch on the extensive on-demand system. Before you know it, you're engrossed in your movie and enjoying your snacks and refreshments. If not for the brief interruption to your movie for the pilot's announcement, you might not have even noticed that the plane had started preparations for takeoff. In fact, you might have nearly forgotten you were on a plane at all. Shortly after a remarkably smooth takeoff, your butler checks in to let you know that the flight has departed on schedule and that the chef is currently hard at work preparing your dinner. In the meantime, he prepares the lounge for dinner by installing the fold-out dining table in front of your seat. You are impressed when he lays out a bright white tablecloth, but the glamour doesn't end there. You are stunned as he lays out your place setting, featuring custom 24-karat gold-plated porcelain dishes, gold-plated cutlery, and signature crystal glassware. Your dinner, sir, as requested. Each course is gluten-free, dairy-free, and vegan, and paired with a wine recommended by our chef. Bon appetit. After one of the best meals of your life, and with a happy wine-induced glow, you decide to turn in for the night. But first, you're going to enjoy your full-height private shower. Your private bathroom is sleek and luxurious looking and stocked with all the amenities you could ever need. After a steamy hot shower and a refreshing scrub with the designer toiletries, you step out of the bathroom to realize that your butler has provided turn-down service and even laid out a bathrobe for you. You crawl into the double bed and relax into the highest quality designer Italian sheets and quickly drift off into sleep. A few hours later, you're awoken by a gentle tapping on the door to your bedroom. It's your butler, waking you up a few hours before landing as requested. You tell him to come in, and he enters holding a covered tray. "Breakfast in bed, sir," he says, placing the tray at the bed in front of you. Knowing you have all the time in the world and feeling utterly refreshed after your sleep, you take your time and savor the gourmet breakfast in bed. Catching up on the latest news on the 27-inch TV above the bed, you finally drag yourself out of bed and freshen up in the bathroom before settling into the lounge for landing. As the plane lands, you can't believe it, but you're almost disappointed that the flight's ending. Luckily, the VIP treatment is far from over. After getting priority deplaning, you're met by your arrivals attaché, who escorts you to the exclusive arrivals lounge. She assures you that your suits are on their way to be pressed and that your bags will be waiting for you in your private car whenever you're ready to depart. She asks if you'd like her to arrange any treatments in the lounge spa before you leave. You can't resist the excuse to extend your experience and immediately book a relaxing massage, followed by a soak and a steam before you freshen up in the private bathroom. Once you're finally relaxed, showered, and dressed in your pressed clothes, you head into the lounge's dining area and linger over a gourmet lunch. As strange as it may seem, you just don't want this flight to end. Finally, you have to admit that you can't stay any longer, and you ask your attaché to have your car prepared. "Of course, sir," she says. "Your bags are being loaded as we speak, and your car will be ready momentarily. As per your request, it'll be one of our low-profile models, but I assure you it is not low on luxury. It was our pleasure hosting you today, and we hope to see you again very soon." As you leave the airport through the VIP exit and climb to the back of your luxury car, you wonder if you'll ever be able to fly any other way again.
Many people hate flying. For some, the possibility of being involved in a plane accident is too terrifying. Who would look forward to being sucked out of a broken plane window thousands of feet above the ground? Fortunately, major plane crashes with large numbers of fatalities are a rare event nowadays. One article reports that the odds of being killed on a single airline flight are 1 in 4.7 million. And contrary to popular belief, most plane crashes are survivable. Reports estimate that the survival rate for airplane accident victims is 96%. Another piece of good news is that you don't have to feel like your life is completely in the hands of fate when you are flying in a plane. There are things that you can do to increase your chances of surviving a plane crash, and we will discuss 5 of them in this episode of the infographic show, How to Survive a Plane Crash. There are many suggestions about how to survive a plane crash online. We have distilled some of the most important ones in our 5 S's of airplane crash survival. Number 1, strive to wear survivor attire. Don't don that 1970s disco queen party dress before a flight. Synthetic fibers, such as polyester and nylon, are flammable. If the plane catches fire after it crashes, clothes made from these materials will melt onto your skin and burn you. Opt for less flammable natural fibers, such as cotton or wool, instead. Save clothes such as short shorts and skirts for another time. Exposed skin is more vulnerable to abrasions and burns than covered skin. Long pants and long sleeve shirts may not look as sexy as your skin-bearing outfits, but they will give you more protection from plane debris and fire. Your choice of shoes is important too. Think how well you'll fare if you have to escape from a wrecked plane wearing flip-flops or stiletto heels. Sneakers and other sturdy, comfortable shoes that you can run in are a better choice. It is also a good idea to keep your shoes on during the entire flight. An emergency can happen at any time, and your shoes can protect your feet if you don't have them on. Number 2, start planning your survival strategy early. Most airlines provide safety materials to their passengers. Pay attention to them. Don't doze off during the pre-flight safety presentation, and read the safety card found in the back pockets of plane seats. While they may not be exciting to go through, they will provide valuable information that could save your life. Decide what plane exits you will use. When you're on the plane, look around for the exit that is closest to your seat and find a backup exit to use as well. Count the number of rows to these exits. This will help you find your way out if smoke or darkness in an emergency situation makes it difficult to see what is around you. Better yet, choose a seat as close to an exit as possible. One article recommends following the 5-row rule, which states that your chances of surviving a plane crash are much greater if your seat is within 5 rows of an exit. Number 3, seatbelts and other safety measures matter. Learn how to use your seatbelt properly before there is an emergency. It is especially important to learn how to loosen your seatbelt quickly so that you don't get stuck in your seat after a plane crash. You should also keep your seatbelt on whenever you sit down, including when you're sleeping. Fasten it tightly because, according to one source, every centimeter of slack in the belt triples the G-force you'll experience in a crash. Keep in mind that both seatbelts and the bracing techniques outlined in pre-flight safety presentations reduce injuries and save lives. Consider these statistics from a recent Boeing study. In a 2015 crash simulation, Boeing found that passengers who both wore their seatbelts and assumed a brace position, that is, flat feet, head cradled against their knees or the seat in front of them if possible, were likeliest to survive a crash. Seat-belted flyers who did not brace suffered serious head injuries, and those with no seatbelts or bracing were more likely to die on impact. Number 4. Stay informed and aware. Planes are filled with different noises and distractions. It can be hard to pay attention to your surroundings if the young woman in the seat next to you won't stop chatting about her undying love for Justin Bieber and a screaming brat is kicking the back of your seat. If you can't be alert during the entire flight, consider following the +3 - 8 rule. One source describes this as follows. The +3 - 8 rule refers to the fact that 80% of all plane crashes occur during takeoff and landing, the first 3 minutes and final 8 minutes of the flight, respectively. Remain aware and alert during this time. Don't read or otherwise distract yourself. In the event of an actual emergency, pay attention to the flight crew and follow their instructions. However, be prepared to think for yourself if they are unable to give directions. You should also be prepared for the possibility that listening to the flight crew might be difficult to do in the chaos of an emergency. Some passengers may not pay attention to the flight crew because they are trying to help other passengers around them, while others are screaming and crying because they are scared. Loud noises coming from damaged parts of the plane can also make it difficult for you and other passengers to hear the pilot or flight attendants over the PA system. In addition, resist participating in another all-too-common scenario played out during airplane accidents. If passengers think the plane is going to crash, some of them will give up trying to save themselves. They will tune out everything else around them and focus on sending a final message to family and friends. This is what happened on Southwest Airlines Flight 1380. One of the plane's engines broke in midair and a piece of it hit one of the plane's windows. According to one report, the passengers' minds raced to how they could say goodbye to loved ones when they thought the plane was going to crash. A passenger interviewed by CNN, named Reverend Timothy Berman, did not even put on the oxygen mask that dropped down. As the plane descended, he thought about his 3 daughters and how he wanted to send them a note from the grave. Don't forget that the survival rate for plane accident victims is 96%. With the exception of one fatality, all of the passengers on Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 survived, and most likely you will too, especially if you don't give up doing what you can to stay alive. Number 5. Save yourself, not your stuff. Don't waste your time trying to save your belongings in the event of a plane crash. Your life is more important than your luggage, and you literally won't have much time to save yourself in a post-crash scenario. You may have as little as 90 seconds to exit from a wrecked plane if it catches on fire. One source notes that within that time period, a burning airplane cabin can reach temperatures that will melt human skin. Instead of worrying about your bags, think about how you will handle flames, smoke, and fumes. Try to protect your nose and mouth with a cloth if you have one. Another danger is that the plane may explode shortly after the crash, so you have to move far enough away from the plane so that you will not be injured by it if it does. However, you want to stay in the area of the accident so that rescuers can see you.
It's early 2006 and the global war on terror is in its 4th year, spearheaded by the US and launched in response to the September 11th terror attacks. The war on terror now spans from the Middle East to the Philippines and even South America. The tendrils of Al-Qaeda and other affiliated terror groups have been secretly spreading across the world, all with the goal of becoming a multinational decentralized agency, capable of carrying on terror operations even if one cell is destroyed elsewhere. The expansion has been stunningly successful, and it would sadly take the deaths of thousands on September 11, 2001, to wake up politicians around the world to the cries of the intelligence agencies who have been warning them of the terror expansion for the last decade. The attacks would reverberate through Americans' daily lives, on the large scale like seeing their military fighting on foreign soil, to small inconveniences like no longer being able to bring water onto a flight. This is the story of how we got there. Inside Pakistan, the United States and Great Britain are both carrying out covert surveillance and espionage operations. Despite overtures of friendship and cooperation, the intelligence agencies of both nations warn their governments that the Pakistanis are secretly aiding and abetting Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other insurgent forces streaming into Afghanistan. The Pakistan government has forbidden NATO forces from carrying out offensive operations against terror networks inside the tribal mountain areas, claiming that it does not want an expansion of hostilities into its border. Secretly though, Pakistan intelligence officers routinely coordinate the crossing of terrorists and insurgents from Pakistan's mountainous border with Afghanistan and supply arms, medical supplies, and even training. For their part, the governments of the United States and Great Britain continue to seek out the cooperation of Pakistan, who hold several key resupply routes into Afghanistan, and believe that they can sway the Pakistanis over to their side. This will prove to be a completely wrong assumption. But in the meantime, at least the US and Britain have both approved the use of covert intelligence operatives inside Pakistan. in violation of their agreements not to carry out intelligence operations inside the nation without alerting Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Agency or ISI. It's an unseasonably hot February morning in Islamabad, capital of Pakistan, when Rashid Rauf enters his usual tea house for a morning drink. A dual citizen of both Britain and Pakistan, Rauf routinely flies from England to Pakistan. With the ramping up of the war on terror though, Rauf quickly earned himself a place on a carefully selected watch list due to his numerous ties to militant groups, some of which held very extremist views. One of those ties includes his marriage to a relative of Maulana Masood Azhar, the head and founder of Jaish-e-Mohammed, a militant terror group whose aim is to separate Kashmir from India and merge it with Pakistan. For weeks now, Rauf has been recorded meeting with representatives of various charities set up to collect donations for the victims of the 2005 Kashmir earthquake, a devastating 7.6 magnitude quake, which killed over 80,000 people. Yet some of the charities have been linked to extremist groups, and it's believed the funds are being used to fuel terror activities. The suspicions of the British agents tailing Rauf is only increased when he then meets with young Muslim men known to have attended extremist mosques. More and more, it seems that Rauf is the critical link in the chain of a budding terror attack. An associate of Rauf's, Abdullah Ahmed Ali, buys a ticket to Britain from Pakistan later that June. By now, the surveillance of Rauf has expanded to his close associates, and it's believed that the two men are cooperating together on an as-yet unknown terror plot against Great Britain. American surveillance on al-Qaeda assets confirms that such a plot exists, but can offer few additional details. As Ali's baggage arrives in England, British police secretly open the luggage and discover packets of Tang, a powdered soft drink, and a large number of batteries. Immediately, the police become suspicious, and British lawmakers approve what will become the UK's largest surveillance operation, pulling in a total of 220 officers from Britain's various police, counterterrorism, military, and intelligence services. Another man, Asad Sarwar, also linked to Rauf and Ali, is then observed buying objects that seem to not fit his daily needs, and he's observed disposing of a large number of empty hydrogen peroxide bottles at a recycling center. Sarwar and Ali are then in a meeting at an East London park, and with evidence mounting, MI5 secretly enter Ali's apartment and discover what appears to be a homemade bomb factory. They covertly install cameras and microphones. By now, al-Qaeda has publicly declared a threat to British aviation, and American intelligence sources confirm the veracity of the threat, though details and methodology of the suspected attack are as of yet unknown. For the British, it becomes clear that Ali and Sarwar have a hand in the plot to come, and their suspicions are confirmed when on August 3rd, Ali and another man, Tanveer Hussain, are filmed inside Ali's apartment constructing explosive devices out of soft drink bottles. The next day, British agents then monitor Ali as he spends 2 hours at an internet cafe, carefully researching international flight timetables. The target, it seems, is British flights headed to North America, with 5 US cities and 2 Canadian cities targeted. On August 9th, the British police spring their trap and arrest 24 suspects, including Sarwar and Ali. Among the suspects is an undercover British officer which had infiltrated the group and warned authorities that an attack was imminent. As the investigation deepened, details of the plot began to come together, and an immediate ban on liquids aboard commercial flights was installed. Back in Pakistan, Rauf is arrested but found not guilty by a Pakistani court. He would be killed in 2008 by a US drone strike. So what exactly was the plot, and why are we now only allowed to carry just over 3 ounces of liquid on a commercial flight? The terrorist plot involved using soft drinks filled with acetone peroxide and hydrogen peroxide, which would be colored with Tang to resemble a normal soft drink. Once aboard, the hydrogen peroxide would be injected into the acetone peroxide, and then a trace amount of a high explosive hidden inside a AA battery casing would be used as the explosive charge to detonate the main bomb. This charge would itself be detonated by linking the bottle of explosives to a light bulb and a disposable camera, with the flash from the camera triggering the explosion. The blast would have been large enough to tear open the fuselage of the Boeing 777s and Airbus A330s being targeted, which would have been done while the plane was on approach and over a crowded city. This would have dropped the plane from the sky, killing over 300 passengers aboard, while causing untold devastation on the crowded cities below, potentially killing hundreds more. In total, it's believed that if the plot had been successful and all targeted planes downed, the total body count would have been far greater than even the 9/11 attacks. Immediately after the plot was discovered and dismantled, the British and American governments forbade passengers from bringing liquids on board an aircraft, with many recognizing that this was simply unfeasible to maintain long-term. Explosives and terrorism experts across America, Britain, and all the world began to test various liquid explosives in order to determine if any amount of liquid would be safe to allow back on a flight. At last, it was determined that 3.4 ounces of liquid represented the minimum risk to an aircraft or passengers, with a blast from this amount of explosive not being large enough to seriously damage an aircraft. While many claimed that terrorists could then simply bring aboard separate amounts of liquid explosives and combine them once airborne, it was determined by explosive experts that it would be impractical and not very realistic for the explosive liquids to be safely mixed into a working explosive compound. Rather, the terrorists would end up ruining the careful mix required or prematurely detonating a much smaller amount of the explosive, severely injuring themselves and doing little to no damage to the aircraft. Sadly, we live in a world of ever-evolving threats and people willing to exploit them to spread their agenda of fear and hatred. While no amount of regulation will ever be enough to keep you truly safe as you fly, governments around the world do the best they can to help keep terror plots at bay and ensure you land safely at your destination, even if it seems arbitrary and like a huge inconvenience to you at the airport. January 3, 1943. During an air raid, B-17 bombers darkened the skies over Nazi-occupied Saint-Nazaire, France. An attack from German anti-aircraft artillery rips through a gun turret on one of the planes. Thankfully, the gunner, U.S. Army Air Force Staff Sergeant Alan McGee, is unharmed, but his parachute has been shredded. Suddenly, more flak blows off part of the plane's right wing, setting the bomber aflame and sending it into a deadly tailspin. What happens next is miraculous. McGee blacks out and is thrown clear of the plane. He falls over 4 miles, some 22,000 feet, and lives. He crashes through the glass roof of a train station, suffering severe injuries. However, German doctors nurse him back to health, and McGee spends most of the rest of World War II as a POW. Interestingly, Sergeant McGee isn't the only person to have survived falling out of an airplane. On January 26, 1972, Vesna Vulovic, a flight attendant, was the sole survivor after a bomb exploded aboard the JAT Yugoslav Airlines flight JU-367. She fell some 33,330 feet, earning a spot in the Guinness World Records for surviving the highest fall without a parachute. Also, who can forget brave Juliana Kopka, whom we profiled in our episode She Fell 10,000 Feet and Survived 11 Days in the Amazon Rainforest. Juliana survived an incredible 2-mile fall and then a trek through the jungle while severely injured. We don't even think we could survive a 2-mile jog, let alone a fall. How common is it to survive falling out of an airplane, though? Is there anything you could do to improve your chances of surviving? The median lethal dose for falls is 4 stories, or about 48 feet. This means that 50% of people who fall from 4 stories will sustain fatal injuries. It only gets worse as height increases. At 7 stories or 84 feet, the chance of survival are 1 in 10. So unfortunately, the chances of survival when falling out of an airplane are pretty slim. No official statistics exist, however. According to various aviation accident websites, there are less than 50 known cases of survival when falling from a plane. That would include falling out of an airplane without a parachute like Sergeant McGee, or falling attached to airplane debris like Vulovic or Kepka. If you're gonna survive the plummet, it's better to fall from the cruising altitude of a commercial flight, which is typically around 35,000 feet, rather than a shorter distance of 1,500 feet. That sounds a little crazy, but hear us out. Falling from around 1,500 feet, or a distance just a little taller than the Empire State Building, means you'll reach your terminal velocity before you hit the ground. As gravity pulls you toward Earth, you fall faster. However, at the same time, your drag increases. When downward force equals upward resistance, acceleration stops, and you'll reach the fastest speed you'll descend at, or your terminal velocity. For average adult humans, this is around 120 to 130 miles per hour. So the impact speed is the same whether you fall from 35,000 feet versus 1,500. What's different is time. 1,500 feet is going to only give you approximately 10 to 12 seconds of free fall before impact, while falling from 35,000 feet or over 6.6 miles will give you about 3 minutes of free fall before you potentially become a pancake. Actually, before and as you fall out of the plane, if possible, grab a hold of plane debris. Becoming a wreckage rider, a term coined by Jim Hamilton, creator of the Free Fall Research website, a database cataloging known free falls, can help you survive the plunge by adding some protection and even somewhat cushioning your fall. Also, the larger surface area of the debris increases air drag, slowing your descent. Flight attendant Vulovic felt jammed between her seat, a catering cart, and the body of another crew member and a section of the airplane. Though she was severely injured, being enclosed in debris helped to shield her from the worst of the impact. Based on statistics from plausible freefall incidents, you're more likely to survive if you're attached to debris than a freefall solo. While free-falling from 35,000 feet, you have enough time to possibly make some very quick decisions on how to mitigate your impact. However, there are drawbacks from falling from such a high distance. At higher altitudes, it's extremely cold. The temperature at 35,000 feet is often in excess of -67 degrees Fahrenheit. A reaction to the cold or rapid change in temperature as you drop is possible. However, there are no reports detailing how individuals have been affected. Frankly, temperature is the least of your worries. At 35,000 feet, oxygen is thin. It's likely that you'll experience hypoxia and spend roughly the first minute of your fall unconscious. You might stay unconscious for the duration of your fall and be spared the last few terrifying moments of your life, but most likely you'll come to once you've fallen around 2 miles. Of course, how fast you're falling and how quickly you regain consciousness are tied to several variables that we cannot account for, such as air currents, the trajectory at which you leave the plane, your mass, and personal blood oxygen saturation level. Once you awaken, you'll have around 2 minutes left to execute any strategies for survival. The first thing you want to do is calm down. We get it, it's extremely hard to adopt a Zen-like attitude when death is most likely imminent, but take a deep breath and try anyway. Although you've regained consciousness, your body is still feeling the effects of hypoxia. If you panic, it's really easy to hyperventilate, slip back into a blackout, and lose valuable freefall seconds you could be using to mitigate your injury or fatality. You need all your wits about you to focus on planning your landing. You cannot do that if you're freaking out. Great, now that you've taken a split second and gotten a hold of yourself, the next thing you want to do is to attempt to slow your fall and gain a few extra seconds of precious freefall time. A good position to create wind resistance is the classic skydiver's pose called the box. To assume, flip onto your stomach and arch your back, lifting your head and shoulders slightly. Spread your arms and legs equal distance. Bend your arms at the elbow. Also bend your knees about a 45-degree angle, leaving your lower leg slightly extended into the wind. Not only will this position help to slow your descent a little, in skydiving it's considered a neutral, stable freefall position from which other maneuvers are performed. From the box, you can move into the slowdown position. Lower your head, turning it to one side, straighten your arms, and further extend your legs, spreading out into an X. Flatten your torso, point your feet and toes as much as possible, and tense your muscles, deliberately pushing against the air. This position provides the greatest resistance possible. If you start to wobble or flip, return to the skydiver's box posture before trying the slow fall position again. Now, take a quick look around. It's unlikely, but you may have a second chance at grabbing a hold of some plane debris to cushion your fall. If suitable wreckage is falling nearby, you may want to try to angle yourself toward it so you can grab on. Skydivers form formations before deploying their parachute, so it's possible to steer toward and grab a hold of objects while falling. However, maneuvering during skydiving does take practice, and generally, it's not something you do on your first jump. Remember, time is at a premium, and it's better to get yourself in the best position possible for impact rather than crash land in a poor position because you were chasing debris. Whether maneuvering to reach debris or aiming for a landing spot, here are some basic moves for steering. From the box position, to turn yourself left, deflect more air off your right arm than your left by moving your left arm down and your right arm up in equal proportion. Imagine an airplane banking. That's exactly what you're doing. To turn right, do the reverse, right arm down, left arm up. You'll continue to turn according to your arm actions until you resume the neutral box position. Another common skydiving move is tracking or moving horizontally while free falling. For a basic side tracking stance, from the box position, straighten your arms and legs. Bring your arms to your side and rotate them out slightly so your palms are facing downward. Flatten your back, lower your head, and curl your body in just a little. Frankly, you're not going to have much time to think about proper skydiving form, so do whatever movement that seems to alter the direction of the drag force acting on your body to try to produce the desired motion to guide yourself. Your next step is to look down for a suitable landing area. It's best if you can land on or in anything that offers give, such as a tree canopy, haystack, or a snowdrift. Swampland or grass are better than plain ground. Even power lines are preferable to the ground because they break your fall. Any ground cover that spreads your impact over a longer period or absorbs it in stages could mean the difference between a couple of broken bones and severe trauma to internal organs. Try not to land in water. It can be as dangerous as landing on concrete. Firstly, you have no way of determining depth. Even when the water is deep enough for landing, once you break the surface of the water, your velocity drops almost instantaneously to zero, exerting strong G-forces on your body. If you must land in water, try to minimize impact by assuming postures that cause a minimum surface area of your body to bear the brunt of the force. That would be a pencil dive position. Jump feet first with your arms held slightly to your sides and your feet pressed together and pointed downward. You're striving to enter the water in a straight vertical line. Also, clench your muscles, especially your butt muscles, unless you want a painful and damaging forced enema. Among experienced cliff divers, injuries such as broken bones, spinal compression, and concussions occur. Even if you survive the dive into the water with only a few broken bones, you may be stunned and slow to respond. Watch out, it's easy to ingest water and possibly drown. To minimize body impact on landing, many researchers think the best posture to assume is one similar to a parachute landing fall. That means landing on the balls of your feet with the legs together and your knees a little bent. Immediately allow your body to crumple slightly backwards and into a horizontal position while turning toward one side of your body as determined by dominant directional speed. Basically, you're attempting to distribute the force of the landing step by step up your torso along 5 points of body contact with the ground: feet, calf, thigh, hip or buttock, and the side of the back. Also, you should tuck your chin and wrap your arms around your head for protection as you land. Furthermore, relax your body as much as possible. This allows you to use your body's natural elasticity to help slow things down over a greater unit of time. Ultimately, you're sacrificing the long bones in your legs, which can absorb a large amount of impact energy before fracturing, for the good of your torso. No matter how you land, of course, you want to try to protect your head and neck as much as possible. Landing head first almost certainly guarantees death. This episode is brought to you by Dashlane. Try Dashlane Premium free for 30 days at dashlane.com/infographics. And never forget another password and keep all your online accounts secure. The celebrity chef everyone loves to hate, Gordon Ramsay, once famously said that there's one place he would never eat, and that's on planes. Except he used more colorful language, of course. Ramsay followed that by saying, "I worked for airlines for 10 years, so I know where this food's been and where it goes, and how long it took before it got on board." If you've eaten on planes, you'll know that everything in those boxes seems to taste, well, just kinda not how it's supposed to taste. Scrambled eggs, for instance, seem to be missing their egginess. Something just feels wrong. The dearly departed chef and food writer Anthony Bourdain said the same, that he refuses to eat on planes and would rather go hungry than risk eating in the skies. So, what's the deal? Why is airline food so awful? First of all, Ramsay actually worked with an airline to help them with their food. He introduced dishes that sounded like they came from a 5-star restaurant. And he's not the first chef that has been hired by airlines. The names of the dishes on many airlines sound pretty enticing. Who wouldn't want to try the red wine braised beef with polenta that was served on Air New Zealand? And surely Austrian Airlines couldn't make a mess of their Viennese schnitzel. When Virgin America introduced their Spanish tapas, you'd think that most folks would not turn their nose up at that. Is Ramsay just a snob? Was Bourdain too picky? The answer is probably no. We should say that flying for a lot of people is a novel thing, and they can't wait to chow down on free food. We guess a lot of you don't mind what you're given, but we very much doubt any of you would say the stuff you got on the plane wouldn't be better than if you got the same dish in a restaurant. We can guarantee you that the Viennese schnitzel is better in Vienna than it is 30,000 feet up in the air, and there are a handful of good reasons for that. One of the obvious reasons why airplane food is not so good is the fact that it's not served to you fresh from the kitchen. It's made in bulk at some place not far from the airport. Travel and Leisure magazine investigated this and so went to Dubai to see where Emirates made their food. They have a huge facility near the airport where thousands of dishes are prepared each day for its own airline as well as many others. The dishes the facility is told to make have been thought over for a long time. We might recall how American Airlines famously saved $40,000 a year by removing one olive from their salad. Okay, so once the dishes have been decided and the budget's figured out, the factory-style restaurant gets down to business. It's really not a restaurant at all, and this is what you might call a food processing plant. The folks preparing the food are made to wear hairnets and in Dubai at least have an air shower before they go near any food, so nothing will fall into the dishes. What we're saying is that plain food is at least probably clean food. When it comes to making the dishes, those that will need to be heated up are made and then they're frozen to specific temperatures. When you get them hot, that's because they've been heated in the plane's convection ovens. According to Travel and Leisure, chefs will prepare meals 8 hours before a flight, with hot food items having a shelf life of 72 hours, though the team typically works within a 43-hour time period. When it comes to meats, chicken might be cooked just 60%, frozen and then finished on the plane, while beef steak might be cooked only 30%, frozen and then finished on the plane. Generally, if the food has been put up on the plane and the plane is delayed and it just sits there, it will have to be taken off and dumped. Airlines will take no risks because if people get sick, there will be big trouble. There was once a famous case on Aerolíneas Argentinas when 76 people got sick and 1 died after eating shrimp that had gone bad. Anyway, so the food is not fresh and it's not been made with loving care. It's mass-produced stuff and made with safety in mind and often using quality ingredients. It's hardly as good as something you'll get at a restaurant. But that's not the only reason this kind of food isn't very good. There's a much bigger reason. Well, there are a few reasons. The food on planes dries out easily, and that's just because of how it got to you. Time magazine tells us that with the food being reheated and thus drying out, in economy many of the dishes are served with lots of sauce, but even then sometimes by the time it gets to you, it's dry. This cannot be avoided. One person who flew with British Airways called an egg sandwich in a review literally pointless. That's what we meant at the start of this when we said eggs lack egginess in the air. But let's say you are traveling in first class and you're looking forward to your lobster and lamb chops. The food has been prepared with more attention and it gets to you fast before it can really dry out. You'll taste it and it's still bad. What's going on? What a lot of people don't know is that when we fly, our taste buds are affected, and that goes for economy travelers and first-class travelers. The cabin pressure in the plane actually affects the palate. We're told that this pressure numbs our taste buds, and having a dry nose doesn't help either, as smelling is a big part of tasting. On top of that, it's said that the constant loud noise you hear on a plane affects how your tongue receives food. In one study, it was found that sound can affect a person's taste buds by 10 to 15%, with the conclusion being that it's something to do with the sensory interactions from the noise and nerves in people's ears. Low air pressure and all those loud noises literally prevent us from picking up on sweet and salty tastes. When the airline Lufthansa studied this, it found that people's ability to taste saltiness and sweetness can drop as much as 30%. Airlines have at least started to realize this after having scientists conduct studies. Some airlines have started to add more spices to make food sweeter or saltier to make the food taste stronger. It was found that some ingredients work in the air while others are compromised, so it's not easy to make all the foods taste better. The proof of the pudding are those horrible eggs. Then some airlines just started adding foods that already have really strong flavors. Since we can hardly taste anything in the air, there isn't much point to having a bland cheese up there, but use blue cheese and people might taste that. The problem though is that a lot of people won't eat blue cheese. Some airlines have been trying new stuff though. We quite like the fact that Cathay Pacific a while back knew normal beer wasn't working well, so they introduced a beer brewed with honey and longanfruit. The wine tastes different up there too, according to some people. They say it's more acidic in the sky, and that's because of the environment it's served in. Maybe next time you fly, have half a glass up there and then try a bit when you land, and see if you can tell the difference. We don't advise you try this with eggs. It could get messy. Food hacks like adding more salt and sugar to food are great, and we love sweet and salty food even when we're not at 30,000 feet in the sky.
Let's say you are flying from Berlin to New York City. For some ungodly reason, both the pilot and co-pilot are unconscious, perhaps after drinking a strange brew delivered to them by a sadistic villain that has a fondness for cats. The passengers are a hysterical mess, and you volunteer to land the plane. According to one pilot when interviewed, you'd have a chance, but you'd have to be on your game and likely not be cursed with having a less than very good attention span. Could you do it? First of all, what kind of plane are you trying to land? A 640-seat Boeing 747-400 or a small six-seater? Let's start with the small plane, and we can pretend we have Justin Bieber and company in the back, and you are the brave bodyguard, albeit with no acumen for flying planes. There would also only be one pilot. Let's say the plane is fine, and you still have contact with air traffic control. Without that, you are all probably fudged. You tell air traffic control the situation. The pilot's totally unconscious. You tell them Mayday, just so they know the gravity of the situation. You are faced with what looks like a cornucopia of switches and buttons and knobs, and you don't know what any of them do. Luckily for you, there are just a few very important things you need to know. That is your height, speed, and your flight profile. According to an aviation website, This is a graph which gives you a step-by-step depiction of a maneuver or phase of flight. It's basically the instructions for what you have to do to land safely. According to the pilot, obviously, don't panic. Don't pull the nose down and head for ground just yet. Just keep going until air traffic tells you that you are close to a place you can land. If you can see the windsock at the airport, you'll know which way the wind is blowing, and it's safer and easier to land into the wind. With the wind behind you, you could land too quickly, and that's where all the deathly kind of things happen. Now, you're going to have to listen to control so you know what buttons to push. Lower the plane to the end of the landing strip, bring out the first flap, and lower it about 30 to 40 degrees. This will make the wing bigger, slow you down, and improve your landing angle. You want to be hitting the runway about a third of the way down. Pull the plane up a bit so you feel you will not just go head first into the tarmac. When you are down, hit the brakes, which are located above the pedals. When you are stopped, turn off the engine. You just saved a pop star. According to the pilot, without someone explaining which button is which, you'd likely not have a chance. So what if it was a massive passenger plane and you were the only one on that plane with the gumption to try and land it? This question comes up a lot on aviation forums, and pilots are there to answer. First of all, you'd have to hope you could get into the cockpit. The good news is you probably have a much better chance at saving 500 people as you did trying to keep Bieber safe. This is because your highly advanced plane has an instrument landing system, aka ILS. One pilot said that getting to the airport and landing should be a piece of cake, because the ILS is in control. You'd still have to tell air traffic control what's going on, and just hope to God you don't have to go manual because of horrible weather or unforeseen emergencies. You will need to set the ILS after speaking with those on the ground. As another pilot says, without autopilot, your chances are very, very slim, unless you have some training. Another pilot said you'd never even get into the cockpit because the cabin crew wouldn't allow you to. If anything, they take over, as some have even learned basic flying skills in their training. The show Mythbusters actually allowed a bunch of amateurs to try and land a plane, and all failed. Everyone virtually died. But when air traffic control was allowed to help, there was success. Another pilot points out something very important, and that is how to use the microphone to actually talk to those down below. You must toggle the switches until you can get through. Otherwise, you are doomed. He explained that you'd have to get low enough to attach the aircraft systems to the runway landing system, set the flight management systems for your approach, and also set the auto brakes. You'd have to follow a lot of directions to do this. And to paraphrase him, if you needed to land without the use of autopilot, you're definitely going to end up on one of YouTube's World's Worst Plane Crashes videos. You might be pleased to know this has never happened in aviation history, at least in a large passenger plane. It's happened a bunch of times since the year 2000, however, in small aircraft. Each of the instances we could find, with the aid of air traffic control, the plane was landed safely. Albeit one time crash landed, and another time the plane was damaged. In each case, everyone on the plane survived. Oh, except in 2 cases, the passed out pilots died later in the hospital due to the reason they passed out in the first place.
We want to give a big thank you to the sponsor of this video, Epic Games, and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, which is available right now on the Epic Games Store. Download it using our link in the description below. Fallen Order is set in one of our favorite periods in the Star Wars timeline, right after the events of Revenge of the Sith, when the Jedi have been branded traitors and hunted down on the orders of Emperor Palpatine. You play as Cal Kestis, a Jedi Padawan who's escaped the Empire's purge and is now living in hiding, shut off from the Force to avoid detection. But soon he's pulled back into the middle of the never-ending battle between the light and dark sides, where he'll work with the Resistance to fight the Empire, seek out hidden Force-sensitive children, and rebuild the Jedi Order. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is available now for $59.99. Click the link below to download it on the Epic Games Store using our supported creator code Infographics, and get a free Stormtrooper skin for Fortnite when you do. If you're a longtime fan of the infographic show, then you probably saw our previous video, Man Who Eats Everything from Human Flesh to Live Eels. In that video, we told you about an unfortunate soul named Tara, who grew up in 19th century France and suffered from a freakish medical condition that saw him have an unstoppable appetite. Always hungry, Tara ate everything he could get his hands on, and eventually was kicked out into the streets by his destitute parents, whom he literally had eaten out of house and home. Eventually, he got a job as a sideshow performer and did everything on stage, from live eels to even kittens. Well, we're back again with another weird eating story, and once more the star of today's show comes to us from France. Seriously, isn't France supposed to be famous for their snooty high-class palates? Go to France and ask for ketchup and see how many people look down their long French noses at you in disgust at your peasant tastes. Yet, for a second time though, our weird eater comes to us from France, which makes us wonder about some of those French stereotypes. Michel Lotito was born in Grenoble, France in 1950, and seemed for all intents and purposes another healthy, perfectly normal child. As he grew up though, he started getting weird cravings, and we're not talking about salted butter mixed with vanilla ice cream weird, which by the way is delicious. We're talking about legit weird, like fresh dirt weird or paper napkins. Late in his teens, those weird cravings grew even stronger, and eventually he was diagnosed with pica, an eating disorder that affects millions of people, though rarely with the severity that it affected Michel. It turns out that pica is one of the most widely studied eating disorders, and the population of a mental institution can have anywhere from 4% to 26% of its patients suffering from this malady on top of other possible mental disorders. Clearly, it's very widespread, yet we don't regularly hear stories about people eating things like metal. That's because most pica sufferers tend to limit themselves to discrete items, such as pieces of plastic, hair, cloth, even small articles of clothing. Patients can actually pull out strands of their own hair and eat it, and one woman who complained of intestinal pains for months was discovered to have a 14-pound hairball in her stomach. The condition comes with many potential health hazards, as to be expected. One of the biggest, though, is a lack of nutritional intake, as the individual feels full from eating non-nutritional items. This can lead to severe weight loss and a threat of catching other illnesses, as the body is too weak to fight off infections. Infections can also come from within, as individuals eat contaminated items, and the ingestion of some of the items, such as metal, can lacerate the insides and pose a very serious threat. In 2008, a British woman was discovered with a whopping 78 pieces of cutlery in her stomach, and she had somehow managed to avoid cutting herself or puncturing her esophagus or stomach while eating sharp forks, though she did say that she purposefully avoided knives. Treatment for pica requires ongoing therapy, and there's no surefire solution to this eating disorder. It's likely that a sufferer will continue to consume innutritious items their whole life, and instead, treatment is all about managing what you eat and how much of it you consume. For Michel Lotito, though, treatment was never an option, and instead he chose to embrace his very unusual eating disorder. At age 16, Michel got into the sideshow business, realizing that he could turn his talent for eating the strange and dangerous into personal profit. He began by eating small items, such as cutlery and other small pieces of metal and plastic, but soon he was moving on to bigger objects. Between 1957 and 1997, Michel ate an estimated 9 tons of metal, which is about 9 tons more than the average human being. The items he ate included a total of 18 bicycles, 15 shopping carts, 7 TV sets, 6 full-size chandeliers, 2 beds, 1 pair of skis, a coffin, 400 meters of steel chain, and a piece de la resistance, an entire Cessna airplane. A Cessna 150 to be exact. He didn't exactly just start munching on the airplane though, it took him several years to complete the feat, eating up to 2 pounds a day of metal. The plane was broken down into small pieces so that he could successfully swallow them, as his prodigious appetite was not backed up with adamantium teeth. If you think he skimped out on the interior parts of the plane, guess again, because he ate not just the metal but the rubber from the seats, the glass in the windows and the cockpit displays, and all the various wiring. Incredibly, Michel, known as Monsieur Mange Tout, which means Mr. Eats All, never once hurt himself eating all this metal and other weird items, nor did he suffer ill effects from toxic materials. Doctors credit this to an unusually thick stomach and intestinal lining, which protected him from the sharpened metal bits and any toxic residues on them. To wash down all that junk, he used a large amount of water, regular tap water or sometimes mineral water. Michel would die on June 25, 2007 at the age of 57. Although not from anything that he ate, he passed away from completely natural causes, though some believe that the special diet he had enjoyed his whole life nonetheless had something to do with his early passing. For us, the biggest mystery here is what it must have felt like on the way out, because the thought of all that sharp, jagged glass and metal going through the exit route scares us to death. Other weird eaters have included the likes of Todd Robbins, who also performs at carnivals and sideshows. He's best known for doing things such as swallowing swords, although he doesn't eat them, and hammering a nail into his nostrils. He also has an affinity for eating glass, though he doesn't suffer from pica and simply does it for the wow value. He generally eats light bulbs and has eaten over 5,000 light bulbs throughout his career. During his routine, he'll screw in a light bulb into a lamp to show the audience it's real, and then unscrew it, remove the metal off the bottom, and then bites into the bulb as if he were eating an apple. Robbins' routine certainly comes with risk, and he's cracked his teeth several times from chowing down on glass. He also admits that he has no idea if eating a light bulb will hurt him or not, remarking that once he's eaten it, he has no idea what it might do on its way through his body. To keep his insides healthy, he maintains a strict diet that includes drinking lots of herbal drinks and eating lots of fiber. Teresa Widener is no sideshow performer and instead prefers to keep her weird eating a discreet affair. Unlike most pica sufferers though, Teresa doesn't like eating many different types of weird objects, just one: rocks. She says she knows she has a hoard of edible rocks in her kitchen that gives her comfort, and she chows down on them as she feels she needs to. Clearly, Teresa's condition is linked to some underlying psychological issues, but so far, her self-treatment doesn't seem to have caused any permanent harm. Teresa explains that she enjoys going out to look for new rocks to eat and even likes to suck the mud off of them before pocketing new acquisitions for her dining collection. If a rock is too big, she'll smash it to pieces with a special hammer before chowing down, and she'll even chew on them with the teeth on the left side of her mouth, which definitely can't be very good for those teeth. Teresa says that she really likes the earthy flavor of rocks though, and they seem to bring her great comfort. We guess that people have certainly done weirder things for comfort, but Teresa says that she does get stomach aches and rarely goes to the toilet. Lastly, we have the story of the subject of an episode of TLC's reality show My Strange Addictions. Known as Cassie, this young woman developed her eating disorder when her husband passed away, and she ended up widowed at the age of 26. Grieving for her husband, Cassie developed a deep depression, and to cope, she would carry her husband's ashes with her everywhere she went. She got into the habit of even cooking meals for him, which she herself would not eat, and she would go to bed with the ashes next to her. You probably already know exactly where this is going, don't you? Well, one day she was carrying the vase with her late husband's ashes in it, and some of them accidentally spilled out, and she got them on her fingers. Not wanting to simply wash them off, she decided to lick them off her fingers. After that, she could no longer stop herself from sampling the ashes from time to time, sneaking in tastes throughout her day. It might be easy to make fun of or be disgusted by people such as Cassie, but clearly, she suffered a deep psychological trauma at a very early age. Expecting to be wed for the rest of her life, Cassie's marriage ended just a few short years after it began, when her husband Sean died from a severe asthma attack. Tragedy can have a funny effect on someone's mind, and though the act may be appalling to the rest of us, eating Sean's ashes was likely a way for her wounded mind to heal from the pain of such a great loss. In June of 2011, those en route from New Jersey to Charlotte may have seen a rather unusual sight: the main body of a plane, specifically of an Airbus A320-214, being hauled along the interstate by a truck. That same company also towed the plane's wings and its back end on the 8-day journey across several states. The size of their load forced them at times to get special permits and take down city streetlights. You might wonder why they did all this, as well as ship the plane's engines down later in 6 large crates. You'll soon find out in this episode of the Infographic Show. The Miracle on the Hudson. U.S. Airways Flight 1549 cleared the runway of LaGuardia Airport at 3:24 p.m. on January 15, 2009, holding 150 passengers and 5 crew. In command was pilot Captain Chelsea Sullenberger, best known as Sully, and alongside him sat Jeff Skiles, his co-pilot, who had just completed his training on the aircraft they flew. Transcripts of their conversation in the cockpit in the minutes that followed revealed rather mundane conversation, including Sully admiring the beautiful scenery. Though it was a chilly 20 degrees Fahrenheit, there was something magical about the Hudson River's shimmering waters down below. But despite appearances, the flight would soon take a disastrous turn. The 150,000-pound Airbus reached an altitude of 700 feet at 230 miles per hour. and at 3:26, Sully contacted air traffic control for clearance to ascend further. A minute after that, it was at 3,000 feet and flying above the Bronx at 250 miles per hour, when suddenly, a flock of Canadian geese flying only 50 miles per hour appeared out of seemingly nowhere. Seeing the geese, Sully screamed. Not long after, Skiles cursed. Those in the plane would describe the sounds of the 4 8-pound birds sucked into the CFM56 5B engines as similar to shoes in a dryer. From the windows of the cabin, passengers could see the engines burst into flames. Then, as their heat cooked the birds' liquefied remains, or snarge, the cabin filled with the smell of burning flesh. The left engine failed first, followed by the one on the right. Almost immediately, the plane became deafeningly and terrifyingly silent. In horror, passengers screamed while others sobbed, and many began to pray. Though they still moved, they started to glide as they now had no thrust or forward propelling power. Experts later claimed that chances were just 1 in a billion at that point that all aboard wouldn't die. Fortunately, Sully, with close to 20,000 hours of commercial airline piloting experience, remained calm and considered the 1 in that statistic a possibility. He had 208 seconds to work with, or less than 4 minutes to decide the best thing to do. In all his pilot training, this was a scenario he had never had the opportunity to practice, so he was completely on his own in uncharted territory. Still, he kept a level head and weighed his best options for landing that could save everyone on board. He first considered returning to LaGuardia before realizing they wouldn't make it without thrust and declining altitude. He then briefly suggested the option of a runway at Teterboro. However, even that was ultimately too far. When told that runway 1 at Teterboro had been cleared, he said that they couldn't do it. It was just minutes after takeoff when Sully grabbed the intercom and the first and only time he spoke to his terrified passengers. His message was all of 3 words: brace for impact. Seconds later, he told air traffic control they weren't going to try for runway, but would be in the Hudson instead. In shock, the control asked if he could repeat his message again, as the warning systems repeatedly urged the captain and his co-pilot to pull up, and that they were too low and the terrain was too near. They ignored them as they prepared to land on their only viable option, the river. It would be only the 4th time ever that a commercial flight made an emergency landing on the water. The men in the cockpit guided the plane toward the Hudson. However, to make it, they would first have to successfully navigate the George Washington Bridge. The plane ended up successfully clearing this obstacle with a cushion of 900 feet, as well as navigating past parts of heavily populated Upper Manhattan. Alarmed residents watched in shock and amazement as it passed uncomfortably close to them in their high-rise apartments. Then both men in the cockpit braced as the plane glided without power toward the water at 150 miles per hour. Those observing would describe it as continuing without noticeably slowing down as it hit the waves full force, then abruptly stopped. Flight 1549 landed on the Hudson River with its nose pointed up at 3:32 in the afternoon, just over 5 minutes after it had originally taken off. It was likely the longest few minutes of the passengers' and crew's lives. Fortunately, while its lower half was submerged and it slowly began to leak water, it still remained afloat. The crew worked to guide all passengers through the emergency exits to stand outside in a huddle on both of its wings. Remarkably, no one panicked, and all worked together to evacuate a passenger in a wheelchair and to hand out vests to those outside. While some inadvertently slipped into the waves, others, worried that the aircraft could explode, jumped in the water and swam off to a safer distance. Before exiting himself, Captain Sullenberger made sure to walk through the entire plane 2 times to ensure no one had been left behind. It was only 3 minutes after the plane hit the water that the first rescue ferry arrived. As it and additional boats and ferries began to approach, many of the passengers lining the wings or treading water uncontrollably shivered. In the current conditions, many were getting extremely cold quite quickly. As it was, everyone was rescued in record time. The New York Police Commissioner claimed that all were in a boat in the span of 5 minutes following their water landing. Remarkably, not a single person died. This was due to the pilot's skill, mixed in with a little bit of luck. Many ferries at 3:30 were preparing for the busiest time of the day and were ready and available to assist with the rescue. That said, the water was still vacant enough that no ferries, tankers, or barges were floating in the way as the plane tried to land. Typically, one of the most crowded waterways in the world. The Hudson having areas completely free of obstacles was very strange. Then, despite one passenger admitting he didn't even fasten his seatbelt, only a handful ended up seriously hurt. More were treated for minor injuries or hypothermia. The mayor of New York quickly came forward to share that Sully did a wonderful job. It was an undertaking of the highest precision, and some claimed that 3 feet one way or the other could have resulted in a much different ending. However, just because the plane had landed did not mean that the ordeal had completely ended. The National Transportation Safety Board still had to conduct its incident investigation. This included in-depth analysis of the plane and the captain's decision-making, as well as the captain and his co-pilot submitting to drug and alcohol testing. Ultimately, an aircraft accident report was released, which included nearly 200 pages of facts, analysis, and conclusions, with supporting charts and figures. It took a year and a half to complete, but in the end, they sided with Sully and supported his actions. Unfortunately, many allege that the way this process was depicted in Clint Eastwood's famous movie about the Hudson-based event dubbed Sully was both unfair as well as inaccurate. Government representatives who were involved didn't appreciate Hollywood's implication that they played the role of prosecution rather than that of an objective investigator. As the leader of the process put it, they weren't the Gestapo or the KGB, but the good guys trying to understand what happened and limit the odds of it happening again. They did ask questions, many personal and at times uncomfortable, during their 18-month-long investigation, but that's just to fully understand what happened, why, and when. As a consequence, the real-life Sullenberger portrayed in the movie by Tom Hanks requested that the real names of investigators in the movie be changed. He claimed that their job was an important one, and Eastwood's portrayal of how they acted was less than fair. Unfortunately, it may have been damaging as well, as it showed the government working against the best interests of the pilots and their passengers, instead of with and for them. Sully, on the other hand, was played well and accurately. He truly was the silent yet brilliant pilot Tom Hanks portrayed, and at first, Sully, who preferred to keep to himself, was quite overwhelmed with his overnight fame. But in time, he saw it as less of a burden and instead as an opportunity to educate others and bring attention to aviation safety. He has continued to make a positive difference, as there's room for improvement in many areas. Further, there's always the possibility that birds will once again hit another plane. Believe it or not, birds often cause problems for planes before the unplanned 2009 Hudson landing, and still continue to pose a potential threat long after. Between 1990 and 2016, bird strikes went up from 1,850 to 13,408 in the United States, and from 2008 to 2015, total international incidents were close to 98,000. Subsequent damage amounts to $1 billion each year. Flights have been diverted and windshields cracked due to various chance encounters, and even Air Force Two was hit on its right side by a bird while Vice President Joe Biden was traveling on it in 2012. The miracle on the Hudson has since inspired the National Transportation Safety Board to warn airports to take whatever measures necessary to limit plane interaction with wildlife, particularly but not exclusively with those that fly. They have approached this problem in different ways. To limit the presence of birds, they've taken away their sources of water, shelter, and food. Unfortunately, at times more drastic measures are required, and LaGuardia and JFK airports often round up and gas their geese. New technology is also in the works that's meant to detect bird presence with the use of radar. This is somewhat challenging, however, due to their small size. Unfortunately, thus far, screens on jet engines blocking birds from entry have also proven impractical and impair engine function. The good news is that now, thanks to the Hudson incident, bird strike preparation is included in most airline trainings. If a similar incident were to happen again, it's still highly unlikely that it'll have as happy an ending. This is why US Airways Flight 1549, a part of a miracle as well as aviation history, needed preserving, and why hiring multiple flatbed trucks to do the hauling over state lines was more than worth it. After its over a week-long journey to Charlotte, the plane was reassembled. This required the efforts of American airline volunteers in addition to Airbus, Hunter Recker, Freeman Ryan Design, and Disaster One representatives. The UNC Charlotte engineering students did their part as well by designing a stand to hold it in place. With its tail almost in contact with the ceiling, it's a monstrous presence in the room of the Aviation Museum in which it's displayed. It's a reminder that in the face of impending disaster, we should still strive to do our best, and we might just pull off the seemingly impossible. What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you on a plane? And do you still enjoy flying? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called A Crocodile with a Kill Count of over 300. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.